Chapter 515. The golden battle flag fluttered in the underground hall. The dazzling radiance on the golden flag not only dispelled the surrounding darkness, but also washed away the shadows like the first rays of the morning sun. It even outlined the fine lines of the silver magic formation on the marble floor. Andrea, Ropar, the pristine angel, and the wind spirit drake were bathed in the light. They witnessed the pendulum golem's last line of defense crumble like a dark border disappearing in the light. But the true victory was not Brando's final attack. The pendulum golem still had the strength to fight. The level 60 to 70 abomination demons still had the upper hand against Ropar and Andrique, who had just awakened their elements. But the pendulum golem had already collapsed. It was like a shaky building collapsing with a loud crash. Bathed in the holy light, the pendulum golem squinted its eyes. It suddenly felt that the entire world was deviating from its original path. And in this deviation, it fell heavily to the ground. Brando witnessed this scene. At that moment, he suddenly understood that the pendulum golem could not hold on any longer. It was only relying on its stubbornness to defend its final door. But this stubbornness finally collapsed when it realized that it could not reverse the situation. The sword-wielding demons burst into flames in front of Brando's army of summons. A blue flame burst out from their bodies, turning them into ashes in the blink of an eye. Not far away, a golden halo lit up on the ground. Within the halo, Aina and her scattered summons appeared. The terrifying ancient abomination Imoku was nowhere to be seen. However, when she turned around, the first thing she saw was the pendulum golem on the ground. Her face was filled with emptiness. When Brendel saw this scene, he knew that she must be feeling terrible. The pendulum golem lay on the ground. The ticking sound under its cloak became weaker and weaker. It did not say a word, and no one knew what it was thinking. Its spells and summons disappeared with its fall. The traces of its existence were like an illusion, eventually turning into white ashes. Aina walked over. Her eyes were red as she knelt down beside the pendulum golem. "Damned wooden fish head, why are you doing this? I really don't understand you, you idiot." "In order to protect my master's rules." The pendulum golem muttered, its metallic voice rising and falling. "Master's every step is necessary. If he cannot defeat me, I will kill him. I can't let down such a great sacrifice. Planeswalkers, we can't afford to make a mistake." The royal sister couldn't help but fall silent. "Do you have to die before you can acknowledge him? Are you satisfied? You're going to die now, you pendulum monster. You clearly know that he is the planeswalker, the first planeswalker to enter this place in thousands of years, and also the last one. Why would you do something so pointless? You idiot, you moron." The dear demoness suddenly cried out as she lay on the pendulum golem's body. "It's precisely because I'm the last one that I have to be even more cautious. Master has also left. Then what do I have to miss?" The pendulum golem's voice seemed to come from its broken body. "Aina, you don't understand. Oh, I wish I was a planeswalker." Brando stood silently beside the two. His summoned creatures had already returned to stand behind him. Although he had defeated his opponent, for some reason, Brando didn't feel the slightest bit of joy. This victory was an accident. Brando himself wasn't prepared to accept this victory. Rather than a victory, it was more like a loss. However, the pendulum golem didn't seem to care about the result. It glanced at Brando, its expression still cold. "I don't trust you, young man. You don't know what a real planeswalker is like. But I hope you won't disappoint me." It shook its head, let out a final sigh, and then became silent. For a moment, only the sound of the deer-bodied banshee crying could be heard in the hall. After crying for a long time, the banshee finally calmed down. She lowered her head and thought for a while, then turned back to look at Brando. The frivolous expression from before had already faded from her face. "You must want to know something, right?" she asked. Brando first shook his head, then nodded. It wasn't that he hadn't seen similar scenes in the game. Won's main storyline was about civilization fighting against fate. The ancestors created history step by step, not through laughter but through blood and sacrifice. He had seen too many of such heavy storylines. But after thinking for a long time, he finally asked, "You actually want to save it, right?" The banshee didn't speak. After a while, she replied, "I'm sorry, I didn't want to use you." "I'm not blaming you for that." Brando shook his head. "It's fine." When the banshee heard that it was fine, she suddenly felt a little warm in her heart. She looked at this human again, and felt that her feelings were understood. This made her feel a little better. But her companion who had accompanied her by the river of time was now lying beside her, no longer having thoughts. Once, when she saw this old-fashioned face, she remembered the time when she was still adventuring with her master. It was so clear that it was like yesterday. But now this last nostalgia was gone. The banshee couldn't help but fall silent again as if she was choked with sobs. After a long time, she said with some difficulty, "I've made a fool of myself in front of you, little one. Now, can you tell me what happened here?" Brando nodded, then asked, "This tomb, this underground hall, and the magic circle on the ground, and your master is the planeswalker Kelsey, right?" Helene nodded. "The pendulum monster and I are Master's summoned creatures. We were once cards of fate. Master brought us to travel through several worlds, starting from a place called Donderkash, the kingdom of Hyarza. The pendulum monster was Master's first creature card. It followed Master much earlier than me, but I was Master's most capable assistant. Because when it comes to planning, I was much better than that wooden fish head." The banshee seemed to be reminiscing about the past, and couldn't help but smile proudly as she said this. "Traveling wasn't always the same. We experienced many interesting things. There were battles, love and friendship. But as Master traveled from one world to another, time passed and Master became older. Traveling was no longer as simple as it was at the beginning. Our opponents also became stronger and stronger. Master seemed to be searching for something. But both of us didn't know what it was. It knew more than me. Master seemed to be fighting against a powerful existence. In the end we came to this place wound. After an earth-shattering battle here, Master stayed here. From then on they worked on the magic circle below us. It took a total of 10 years before it was finally completed. The tomb outside was just a cover to hide the work below. The owner of the tomb was a noble. I remember that he was a very interesting young man. But after a few decades he died of an illness and was buried in this tomb." Brando listened attentively. He knew that Wound was just a general name for the world in which the game was set. But in fact, the Amber Sword's worldview was beyond imagination. Although since the beginning of the Second Era, people had always known that there were other worlds behind the fog behind the dark forest. Those were worlds that were as big as Wound and were guarded by Martha. But other than planeswalkers, no one could travel between these worlds. So legends were just legends. And then Master chose to hibernate here. Master did not die because his lifespan ran out. In fact, a planeswalker's lifespan is almost endless. Because he was too injured, he had to choose this place as his final resting place. Before he could rest, Master gave me and the pendulum monster life, allowing us to become physical beings with a part of his power. But after all, we were not real planeswalkers. Master's final task was to guard this underground hall and not let any mortals enter. Until one day someone with his power appeared. And this person, Ina raised her head and looked at Brando, "Is you." "Me?" Brando thought that it could not be so coincidental. The so-called quests in the Amber Sword all required certain conditions to trigger. Especially the player's experience. For example, if a player from Madara went to find Amandina with a letter from her father, even if they found her, she might not necessarily follow Madara's side. Because of the NPCs themselves and some other factors, they were selective in how they carried out the quests. But he felt that perhaps this was not a coincidence. If it was not for the cards of fate, he would not have come here. And if he was not a planeswalker, he would not have any interest in the cards of fate. So there was fate in the world, and some coincidences were not really coincidences in the long run. So then, what is the purpose of this hall? We don't know exactly what it is used for. But Master was very cautious about it. I only know that in order to build this hall, other than Master, there were 2 other powerful beings who sacrificed their lives. Ina thought carefully and replied. 2 powerful beings, were they planeswalkers? No, Ina shook her head, but I have seen one of them. She was very powerful, not inferior to my master. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. An existence that was as powerful as a planeswalker, what kind of concept was that? If Kelsey could summon the projection of Imoku, the eternal trauma, his strength would have far surpassed any of the powerful beings that Brando had seen in his 2 lives. And from the Darkness Dragon's tyranny to the War of the Holy Saints until now, Brando could not think of any legendary existence that had such a level of strength. Unless it was the Darkness Dragon himself, but the Darkness Dragon was not a woman. Taking 10,000 steps back, what was the point of sacrificing 3 existences of Kelsey's level to construct a hall like this? Brando did not think that it was just to leave behind the inheritance of the paradise of adversity. There must be some secret hidden below. But looking at Ina's expression, it did not seem like she was lying to him. Maybe they really did not know what was below. Can you remember when you came to Wond? Which era was it? Brando thought for a while and asked again. Ina thought carefully for a while. This period of history was quite old for her, and it was not easy to remember. Well, I don't know if their method of counting back then was the same as the one you are familiar with now. When we came to this world with Master, according to the local method of counting, it should be the year 540 Orcus. Brando was stunned. The people of Cruz began to count the years with the method of counting, which was already a distant history. It was said that when the Azure Night shattered the sky and brought about the Second Era, this new method of counting the years began to spread. The person who created this method was said to be the most outstanding sage of the Myrna people, Tumen. At the same time, Brando now knew that he was also a planeswalker. But this theory was not very tenable because according to the research of scholars, the new method of counting the years was recorded much later, and could only be traced back to the era of the War of the Holy Saints. But no matter which one it was, he had never heard of a method of counting the years like Orcus 540. Well, I admit that I have never heard of such a method of counting the years. Brando sighed and shrugged. He thought for a while and said, Then in the history of that time, are there any famous people you know? The woman who came here with Master is one of them, but I don't recognize her name. There was another person at that time and you should know this person. He was also a planeswalker like Master but much more powerful than Master. Little guy, you have inherited this person's legacy. Tumen? Brando almost jumped up. Tumen. Martha above, when you came to Wond, it was the era when Tumen was still alive? How many years ago was that? It should be about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Wait. If I remember correctly, the darkness dragon Odin wasn't dead at that time, right? Brendel pressed his forehead with one hand and felt a slight pain in his temples. If I remember correctly, the darkness dragon Odin wasn't dead yet. Odin. Ina looked at him and said, I have heard of this name. Correction of a mistake. Fireclaw Lord Ropar's card was originally a silver rare card, and I described it as a normal card yesterday. So after upgrading it should be gold. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 5:16. Tumen said that they had a supreme leader in the north, and he and the powerful woman followed him. That person was called Odin. They had been fighting against the cultists and the demons that had spread from the scorching hell to the surface. These people were also my master's enemies, so my master agreed to join the war. The war lasted for decades until the last great war. That should be the last few wars between the Dark Dragon and the cultists. At that time, the Twilight Dragon had been defeated by the Azure Knight in the sky, and the power of chaos had been restrained. After the war, Odin unified the whole of Wond. The people who sacrificed their lives thought that they had gained hope, but they did not expect that the dark and cruel rule had just begun. Orthless suddenly said in Brando's mind as if she was a little emotional. If not for that, there would not have been the War of the Holy Saints and there would not have been the Four Sages. Because of one person, countless people died in vain. He was once a hero and I have no reason to hate him, but I still can't forgive his actions. Brando nodded silently. He knew this part of history. The Azure Knight shattered the sky and brought about the Second Era, but the first 10 centuries of the Second Era were still covered in darkness. It was said that Madara, the witches, and the Myrnas were the remnants of the Dark Dragon, and they were also the main enemies that Brando faced in the game. Although he had coincidentally received Odin's inheritance, he still held some grudges in his heart. Orthless sensed Brando's thoughts, and she was secretly shocked by this young man's knowledge of history. The history that she spoke of was already unknown to the present day, and only the wizards of the Silver City who buried themselves in scrolls all day long might know about it. However, Brando was not surprised when he heard this. These details that he had inadvertently revealed had already made Orthless slightly suspicious. Legend had it that the Dark Dragon could see through people's hearts and understand everything. This was an ancient prophecy of the witches, and Orthless knew about it. She knew that Brando now had the blood of the Dark Dragon flowing in his body, and she could not help but wonder if this was really just a coincidence. But Brendel had already understood the cause and effect of the war. He raised his head and looked at the ceiling of the underground hall that was gradually hidden in the darkness, and his curiosity grew even stronger. Beside him, Helene seemed to have seen through his thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, but since Brando had already been acknowledged, she said, "Little guy, if you really want to know the secret of this place, I'll take you to a place." Brando turned around. Helene said the place was the pendulum golem's body, but she said she wanted to take care of the pendulum before she could bring Brando. Brando did not object and only waited silently at the side. Towards the pendulum golem, the most unique enemy he had ever met, he still had the necessary respect in his heart. Anyone who had their own beliefs and beliefs should at least be respected. The dear demoness fixed the pendulum golem's body and placed it on her back. Her movements were gentle, as if she was afraid that she would hurt her companion. However, the cumbersome pendulum golem was much heavier than her, so it looked somewhat comical, but at this moment no one was laughing. However, as the two of them moved, Brando discovered a problem. He realized that the golden battle flag could not be taken away. It turned out that this treasure had been inserted into the ground as soon as it entered the arena, forming an area similar to that of a treasure barrier. Within this area, all treasures and cards would be upgraded by one tier. However, this area was fixed about a kilometer in radius and could not be moved. This was a little awkward. Brando tried to think of a way to remove the golden battle flag, but to no avail. In the end, it was the dear demoness who reminded him that this treasure barrier had two uses. One was to attach to something and only worked on that thing. The other was to attach to the arena, and only worked on a certain area. The golden battle flag was obviously the latter. In this case, it could only wait for the reset phase to be shuffled back into the deck for the next use. Brando was a little helpless but also relieved. The Amber Sword never had an item that was so strong that it couldn't be countered. Presumably, it was the same for the cards of fate. Moreover, the dear Banshee had said that planeswalkers weren't invincible. There were people in the real world who could rival them. This showed that the power of the cards of fate wasn't limitless. In fact, Brando had already discovered that the cards of fate had many restrictions. There were requirements to enter the arena, and there were limitations to mana. Moreover, Irene also told him that the land of a planeswalker was not unlimited. The capacity of the land was closely related to the strength of the planeswalker. She told Brando that he would understand this point when he became an official planeswalker. Therefore, after discovering the limitations of the golden battle flag, Brando felt relieved. This was because compared to the limitations of other cards, this was the strength of the secret cards. Although the dear demoness was not a planeswalker herself, she had a lot of knowledge about planeswalkers. She told Brando that because of the power of the golden battle flag, it could become the core card of his deck. In this case, he needed to find a way to filter cards so that he could be the first to grab the golden battle flag from the deck in every battle. For example, she said that generally speaking, there were two ways to grab cards. The first way was to grab more cards to increase the chances of getting a specific card, such as her mind acceleration barrier. The other way was to filter a specific card from the deck, such as selecting a creature card from the deck and shuffling the hand, or selecting a treasure card from the deck and absorbing it into the hand. Irene thought for a moment and told Brando that the pendulum golem's core card in the dark realm of adversity, the impasse Trojan horse, was such a card. However, it was used to filter the creature cards, and its effect was stronger than the average filter card. But the dear demoness did not say how strong it was. Brando looked at her and she said, "Both the pendulum golem and I have recognized you as the inheritor of the paradise of adversity. Therefore this core card will be given to you sooner or later, so allow me to keep you in suspense." For Irene to say such words, it meant that she had at least slightly recovered from her previous sadness. Brando also let out a sigh of relief. While the two were talking, they entered a small natural cave that had not been artificially carved. There was a nest here that looked like an underground wind tunnel, and it was a typical water cave. This area was called the Maze of Einar by the people of Cruz. Einar was a monster with goat ears. According to legend, it was the servant of the goddess of earth, and it enjoyed building mazes. However, even the most complicated place would lose its mystery after thousands of years of exploration. Irene led Brando through the long cave as if she was taking a stroll in her own backyard. Then the two entered a man-made tunnel at the end of the cave. This tunnel had a staircase that led downwards. At the bottom of the staircase, a large cave appeared. As soon as Brando entered the cave, he was stunned by the scene in front of him. He saw that the walls of the cave were made of endless crystals, and inside the crystals were three people. The first person Brendel saw was the planeswalker Kelsey. He was an old man and his attire was no different from that of a normal magus. Although he still maintained his appearance when he was alive, his skin was gray and his muscles were sagging. Wrinkles drooped down as if they had lost their vitality, as if the hidden injuries in his body had exhausted all of his life force, and he was on the verge of death. But even with such an old appearance, one could still feel the immense power in his withered body. Brando did not know that this old man was Kelsey, but for some reason when he saw him, he felt as if he was facing the whole world. When he looked at the expression of the dear demoness beside him, he completely understood what was going on. "This is your master?" The dear demoness nodded. She put down the remains of the pendulum golem and silently placed it beside the crystal. This time she did not cry. At this moment, Brando suddenly realized that there seemed to be a layer of veins floating on the crystal wall. He was shocked, but after a closer look, he realized that it was indeed so. He suddenly raised his head and saw that the veins on the crystal wall were connected to the ceiling of the cave. Brando immediately realized that the ceiling of the cave was also covered in mysterious runes made of mithril. It was similar to the spell formation on the ground outside. He was slightly stunned. At first he did not understand why this was done. But suddenly he sucked in a breath of cold air. This was because the light on the crystal was clearly being maintained by drawing on the energy of the three people inside. Martha above, the three people in the crystal must have been sealed here willingly. What kind of power could make such powerful beings give up their lives to guard this place forever? His throat was dry, and he could not help but touch the crystal with his hand. He then turned his gaze to the second person. This was a middle-aged swordsman. His face was chiseled and he looked resolute and powerful. Even with his eyes closed, he gave off an imposing aura. He could not help but ask, "Who is this?" "This is the most outstanding swordsman I have ever seen. He is the leader of the natives of this place." The dear demoness looked at the middle-aged swordsman with respect. Brando then looked at the third person. With just one glance he could not look away. He had never seen such a beautiful scene. The girl sealed in the crystal was like a goddess from the legends. She wore a pure white silk dress. This style of dress was very rare nowadays. It looked like the white robes of the ancient Greek cities, but with many layers, it had a modern style. The long dress was embedded in the crystal, and it bloomed like a pure white lotus flower as if it was blown by the wind. Time stopped at this moment. The girl's eyes were closed. She looked at most 17 or 18 years old. Her long hair was completely stretched out in all directions. It was white, so were her eyelashes and skin. It was like an ice crystal without a trace of blood. Her whole person and her white dress formed a unique scene. Brando had never seen such a beautiful woman, especially with that kind of temperament. "Is she dead?" He could not help but ask. The dear demoness nodded. Brando knew that he had asked a stupid question. The three people in the crystal obviously came from the same era. She had been sleeping here with them for thousands of years. But he did not know why. When he saw this woman he felt that something was wrong. He suddenly felt a subtle feeling. It should be said that it was familiar. He did not understand why he had this feeling. He could swear that no matter which world he was in, he had definitely seen or even heard of such a scene. Such a beautiful woman, Brando believed that if he had seen her once, he would definitely have an impression of her. But at this time the first thing that appeared in his mind was Aunt Jenny, then the little Roman, and finally Babasha. That old and ugly woman. Brando was shocked. He suddenly understood and blurted out, "Witch?" He remembered who this girl was. The Queen of Ice, the first witch king before the golden age of witches. There was a deep resonance from the crystal. This sound went straight to the ground as if it was responding to something. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 517. As the fire burned, the charcoal occasionally crackled and the light dimmed a little. Light and shadow intertwined in the passage of the tomb. The little Roman sat alone by the fire, her face red from the light. For some time she had been watching the sparks rise to the top of the cave with great interest. The sparkling eyeballs moved from bottom to top, and then from top to bottom, very lifelike. It had been an hour since the tomb collapsed, and the wizards had spent at least half an hour to open up a ventilation window before they could light the fire. The merchant lady used an iron rod to skewer the graveyard moss. God knows why she carried it with her, but Brando knew that she always had a full set of field supplies in her leather bag. The flames roasted the moss until it sizzled. The moss was the base material for the witch's prophecy potion, plus 2 wisdom, lasts for 10 minutes, in the amber sword. No matter how you looked at it, it looked more like gray moss, but the Romans stubbornly believed that it was a mushroom. If the merchant lady said it was a mushroom, then it was a mushroom. The Shire was too embarrassed to tell the future lord's wife that she had burned 2 gold coins, so he could only pretend that he did not see it. Otherwise he would be invited to eat graveyard moss. Mr. Adept did not think that his physique and poison resistance were better than his lord's, so he decisively declined the invitation. The Shire was just as confused as everyone else. His lord had announced his relationship with the Roman lady long ago, but the two did not look like a couple. This was quite puzzling. In Wonde, it was normal for nobles to have a wife at the age of 15. Someone at Brando's age who was still single was not rare, but almost non-existent. The Shire would occasionally secretly wonder if his lord had any problems in that area. In fact, as a knowledgeable Highland wizard, he happened to know some ancient herbal recipes. But even if he was beaten to death, he would not dare to ask this question in front of Brendel. He had a smart intuition that if he said that, he would definitely be locked up in a small dark room. Therefore, all this time, no matter if it was him or his subordinates, they all addressed the Roman lady as their lord's fiancée. However, this had been going on for more than a year. Brando might not have noticed it, but to outsiders, it was a little strange. Charles thought about it and decided to find an opportunity to tactfully mention it to his lord. Otherwise, it would not be good if it caused any trouble. The smell of burnt graveyard moss smelled a little like roasted shoes. Such a subtle smell drifted in the cave. What was commendable was that the others acted as if nothing had happened and pretended not to smell it. The Shire held a blueprint that his apprentice had just finished and stared at the collapsed part of the tomb with a serious expression on his face. The excavation work was not going well. The magic power was not as strong as they had imagined. Moreover, the key issue was not to open up a path, but to prevent the sand and stones from rolling down. The Shire did not have the ability to use magic to support a 50-meter-long section of the mountain. Fortunately, the people outside had already contacted Medisha. Once the Silver Fairy Princess and the female vampire arrived, it was only a matter of time before they could open up the path. However, at this moment, the Roman lady suddenly felt the ground under the tomb tremble slightly. She raised her head and looked at the others curiously, but it seemed that no one had noticed it except for her. The Shire saw the merchant lady raise her head and could not help but shiver. He braced himself and asked, "Is something wrong, Miss Roman?" The Roman tilted her head and looked at him. She paused for a moment and her bright eyes seemed to ask, "Did you hear something?" However, the Shire did not have the ability to read minds, so he could not figure out what the merchant lady was up to. He looked at the Roman in confusion. The merchant lady blinked her eyes and asked, "Is Brando all right?" "My lord is still down there. Don't worry, he is safe. Nothing will happen to him." The Shire replied respectfully. He was afraid that the merchant lady would treat him to graveyard moss if she was unhappy or happy. But Martha was above. It seemed that the Roman treasured the mushrooms she roasted and did not intend to share the moss. She was determined to give it all to Brando, so she said, "Then it's nothing. Thank you." The Shire wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and prayed for his lord. He prayed that the Martha above would bless his great lord's ability to resist the poison. Otherwise he would not have an easy time tonight. The Shire could not help but think that if the Roman kindly treated Brando to the graveyard moss, would his lord choose to eat it? Or would he choose to eat it? Thinking of this, he could not help but laugh to the point that he hurt his internal organs. But what the Shire did not know was that after the merchant lady finished talking to him, she turned her head back and seemed to be focusing on counting the sparks. But the Roman's hands were placed properly on her leather bag. In reality, she was looking at the other side of the bonfire at the girl sitting opposite her. The girl was only 1 or 2 years older than her, but her expression was very gentle. She looked at the Roman as if she was looking at her own child. She saw the Roman seriously handing over a skewer of graveyard moss and could not help but smile bitterly. "Sorry, little girl, I don't like to eat this kind of thing. They don't seem to be able to see you." Romaine looked at the Shire and asked. She was not an idiot. On the contrary, she was quite intelligent. Brando understood this after that night in the refugee camp. But in the eyes of outsiders, this merchant lady was just a strange person who was easy to get along with. This was a secret shared by both her and Brando. Freya knew a little and Amandina more or less guessed something. The girl nodded, "Because only you can see me. Even the inheritor of the person below can't see me." "Are you talking about Brando?" the Roman asked. "That young man is called Brando, right? Thank you for telling me his name. If you want to harm him, I won't talk to you anymore," the Roman declared sternly. The girl did not know whether to laugh or cry. "No, I'm just thanking him. I always want to hear about the outside world. Besides, he brought you here, so I'll only be thanking him." "Then why am I the only one who can see you?" the merchant lady asked curiously. "Because you and I have the same blood," the girl replied. She tilted her head and looked at the Roman carefully. But it was obvious that she liked this little girl from Bucci. Her eyes revealed a satisfied expression. The Roman thought for a while and raised her small eyebrows. "I have the same blood as you? Are you saying that you're my mother?" The girl smiled bitterly again. "Of course not," she said. If you want to say it, I should be your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother? She suddenly stopped and realized that she had been affected by the girl. Even the way she spoke had become a mess. She couldn't help but shake her head. All right, I won't joke around. Do you know what kind of power you have? I think you should have grasped some of it, right? I know, the Roman nodded. A dwarf told me that I'm a warlock because I was born with magic. The girl looked at the Roman curiously. You're not a warlock. You're a witch, and a natural one at that. You have the blood of the Witch of Fate flowing in your veins, and your constellation is the daughter of the harp. But after today it won't be like that. From today onwards, your constellation will be the Witch King. The Roman didn't quite understand, but the dwarf clearly said that I'm a warlock. The merchant girl thought for a while, and I think that warlock sounds more powerful. The first Witch King before the Golden Era, the creator of the 13 witch bloodlines, the spouse of the dark dragon Odin, she rarely met a worthy opponent in her lifetime, and she didn't think that there was anyone who could defeat her. But until today the Queen of Ice had to admit that there were some people in this world that she couldn't defeat. What did he mean by, and I think that warlock sounds more powerful? If it was one of her 13 subordinates who dared to say that to her, she might have cast a spell and sent that person into the ice labyrinth to suffer for eternity. However, her temper was much better now. Besides, she might not be able to do anything to her descendant. Most importantly, there was not enough time. She was overjoyed to be able to meet a true successor before her power was about to be exhausted. The first Witch King had no choice but to coax. Don't worry. Even if you accept my legacy, you will still retain your warlock abilities. When the girl said this, she wanted to bang her head against the wall. It was clearly the innate ability of the Witch of Fate, but she had to say that it was the power of a warlock. Moreover, she couldn't refute it. After all, warlocks were the archenemies of the witches. What was she saying? If it wasn't for her image, the legendary Witch King would have burst into tears. She was the one who personally gave the right to become the Witch King. This was something that many people couldn't even dream of. But she had to coax and lie to this little girl. This was a complete disgrace. The Roman thought about it carefully. As a merchant, she had to be careful with her spending. But in the end, probably because she felt that it was a win-win situation, she nodded cautiously. Good child, the Witch King said weakly. Even the novelty of seeing her descendant after countless years had disappeared. She stretched out her hand and tapped the Roman's forehead. The merchant girl instantly felt countless knowledge surging into her mind. I'm almost out of power, so I can't help you much. But the knowledge I give you will be of great help to you one day. The girl sighed. Maybe it's fate. You happen to be a Witch of Fate. This knowledge will gradually come into play as you grow. But the key is that you have to remember that the Witch King's mark I gave you is the only mark to open the treasure of the Witch Kingdom. One day you will unify the 13 bloodlines. This mark will play a huge role. Do you understand? Roman felt dizzy. She held her head and nodded, not fully understanding. The girl couldn't help but sigh when she saw her like this. She didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse for her only successor to be like this. But whether it was right or wrong, the first Witch King didn't want to stay here for a moment longer. She was afraid that the little girl would come up with another idea and choke her half to death. She felt that her limited dignity couldn't withstand such a torment. She retracted her finger and paused for a moment. Then she disappeared into the tomb. Roman was left looking left and right, unable to figure out what was going on for a moment. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 5:18. There seems to be something underneath the magic circle. Orthless whispered to Brando after a careful observation. She could vaguely feel a corrosive magic seeping up from the ground. Wind elves were naturally sensitive to magic. Otherwise, they would not have been able to create magical sword skills. Brando nodded. Orthless led the way. After leaving the cave of crystals, they continued to go deeper. After walking for a while, the walls of the underground chamber suddenly showed a strange dark red color. Upon closer inspection, the dark red color was actually caused by a kind of sandstone. The sandstone seemed to be embedded with quartz, and it sparkled under the light. Brando touched it with his hand. When he raised his hand, he was shocked to find that his hand was covered with crystal powder. What's going on? He could not help but stop and ask. The rocks here have always been like this. It has been like this since the underground chamber was built. Orthless picked up the broken stones on the ground and looked at them. But recently, the crystallization of the rocks has become more and more serious. The red sandstone did not extend to this position before. Brando instinctively felt that something was wrong. Do you know this kind of rock? He bent down to pick up a broken stone and whispered to Orthless. Orthless looked at the stone in his hand and thought for a while before replying. The characteristics of this rock are a bit like the magic quartz sand from the Black Forest. Have you heard of it? Magic quartz sand was a kind of sandstone magic crystal or that was formed when a region was contaminated by magic. It was often found near the streams in the Black Forest. It looked a bit like colorful sand. Most of these crystals were not pure. Travelers who came across them could make a small fortune, but it was not worth it to organize a team to mine them. Brando of course had heard of this mineral. He picked up the stone and said, "We will know whether it is or not after experimenting with it." Detecting the distribution of magic elements was a basic task for any spellcaster. Brando was also an elementalist, so it was not difficult for him to do this. He held the stone with his left hand and stretched out his right thumb, index finger and middle finger. He aligned the magic triangle and chanted a mysterious rune. The stone immediately emitted a faint light. It is. Orthless nodded. However, this level of magic quartz sand was not even at the level of a normal mineral. The magic it contained was mottled and impure, and there was no value in mining it. Simply put, it was unnecessary to even bring a piece back home. That means this place is heavily contaminated by magic. Brando raised his head and looked around vigilantly. But this place is under the protection of Lady Martha, Brando. That's why it's suspicious. Brendel threw the stone away and raised his head, just in time to see Elaine stop. To go in. Brendel took 2 steps forward, wanting to see what was inside. But just as he lifted his foot, a golden ripple suddenly appeared 10 feet in front of him. Then a golden translucent magic circle appeared, spinning slowly like the hands of a clock. Brando originally wanted to go in and take a look, but when he saw the magic circle he suddenly changed his mind. Let's go back. Orthless and the dear Demoness were surprised. They thought Brando would definitely go in to take a look. Orthless was slightly startled. She seemed to have thought of something and quickly explained, "This magic circle is a seal set by Master, but it does not prevent me from bringing you in." But Brando shook his head as if he had made up his mind. No need. Since there is nothing to see, there is no need to trouble yourself. The fewer times a seal is opened, the better. That's true. Orthless nodded, but she looked at Brando with some doubt. She had followed Kelsey for hundreds of years, and her knowledge was not inferior to Brando's. Of course she would not believe Brando's excuse. But since Brando did not want to, she did not force him. Orthless also had the same question, but she was much more direct. "Brendel, what's wrong?" she whispered to Brendel. "Brendel, what's wrong?" "Nothing, I instinctively feel that there is danger." Brando shook his head. Orthless understood. She knew that Brando trusted his own judgment. Although most young people his age did not have such experience in judgment, Orthless knew that Brando was an exception. His judgment was always relatively accurate, and was not inferior to a 1,000-year-old monster like her. On the other hand, the reason Brando did not want to go in was very simple. That was because the magic circle was the same as the seal outside. In the Amber Sword, the only function of the magic circle was to mark the level of a dungeon. The magic circle outside was called the Wall of Chaos, which was the seal of level 30 to 40 dungeons. The magic circle inside was called the Age of Time, which was the entrance to level 300 dungeons. So when Brando saw the seal, he decisively gave up on the idea. He thought that he had not lived long enough. Note, Brendel's level of 130 is a pure warrior's level. In reality, players usually have more than one job. Therefore, a level 40 dungeon is prepared for a level 30 group of players, and a level 300 dungeon is for a level 150 group of the world's top players. Even though he really wanted to know what was buried underground, his life was more important. He decided to take a break when he saw the magic formation. When he had time in the future, he would return to this place. "Then are you ready to go back?" Ina suddenly asked. "But I can't directly send you back to the surface. You may have to wait for your companions to dig a path." "It's okay." Brando did not mind. He smiled. "I have some questions about planeswalkers that I want to ask you. Then let's go back to the hall." Ina nodded and looked into the depths of the cave. "Actually, I don't really like it here." "Me too." Brendel took a deep look at the level 300 magic formation and nodded. Time passed much longer underground than on the surface. It was as if the little Roman had unknowingly obtained a huge secret. The Shire was very busy, and it was not easy to wait for the great silver elf princess and the vampire trap. It took them 3 to 4 hours to finally open a path, and then almost the same amount of time to dig into the tomb. At this time, Brando had already gotten most of the answers he wanted to know from Ina. Last question. The information he got from Ina was completely different from Tumen's. It should be said that it was more detailed, plain and rich in details. Brando only now understood that planeswalkers were not separated from Won's history. They had always existed and once fought with the ancestors against the Twilight Dragon, and even played the role of a leader. Brando even learned that the Darkness Dragon Odin was once a planeswalker. This information was beyond his expectations, but it seemed to be within his expectations. With the Darkness Dragon's strength, it was possible for him to become a planeswalker. Moreover, the Darkness Dragon often led his dark army into battle. It was hard to say if there were no summons among them. It was just that history was too long ago and it was impossible to verify. The only thing that puzzled Brando was that when Odin spoke to him in the Sealing Stone fragment, he did not mention a single word about planeswalkers. He did not know if it was because the inheritance was not complete. However, with so many planeswalkers, it made him wonder how many planeswalkers there were in this world. He could not help but ask this question. Lady Ina, you once said that I was the last one. Then can you tell me how many planeswalkers are there in the world today? The dear Demoness seemed to have expected him to ask such a question. She sighed and said, in the earliest era of the planeswalkers' history, that is, the Earth Slate was still in Ebabel Fortress. It had not been stolen by the traitor of the gods, Hodel, and was lost. The planeswalkers formed a council, and this council had a total of 43 members. Later on, when the Twilight Dragon came, most of the planeswalkers withered away in the war where the gods fell. Until the darkness of the ancient epic prophecy descended upon the earth, only 13 planeswalkers' inheritances remained. My master Kelsey was one of them. As far as I know, most of these 13 inheritances did not end well. 3,000 years ago there were only 6 left. And among these 6, there were almost no true inheritors. Therefore, if I am not wrong, among this generation of planeswalkers, you may be the only inheritor. You're saying that I am the only planeswalker left? Brando was speechless. He could not believe that such a powerful planeswalker would wither away to this extent. Not necessarily. It is possible that there are a few old farts that still exist. However, the number of inheritors of planeswalkers is decreasing. This is an undeniable fact. Ina shook her head. I don't know why, but the requirements to become a planeswalker are extremely harsh. Most people can't even come into contact with the laws of cards. Among them, there are a few who can cross this boundary, but most of them stay at the apprentice level their whole lives. Stay at the apprentice level? Brando frowned. He himself had not broken through the apprentice level yet. But just as he was about to speak, he saw Ina raise her index finger to her lips and say, "Shh." Brando turned around. He and Ina had been staying in the tunnel not far from the tomb above. Now that they had quietened down, they heard the sound of shovels digging from above. Your companions are here, Ina said softly. All right, let's stop here. I don't want others to see us. Brando was slightly startled. Only then did he realize what Ina meant. Aren't you coming with me, Lady Ina? He could not help but look at her in surprise. But Ina only smiled at him. She took 2 steps back and stood in the darkness. Those eyes that seemed to be able to speak flickered with an indescribable brilliance. Brando had seen the determination to never give up in those eyes, but now there was only gentleness and hope. At that moment, Brando understood that she was really going to leave him. P.S. I drew some pictures in the afternoon to change my mind, so the update is a bit late. I drew some pictures of Amber's characters, mainly because the starting point is not very convenient. If I have time, I will put it in the public chapter. Also, there has been a lot of discussion recently about the Planeswalker plot. Some people may think that this has nothing to do with the main story, but that is not the case. This plot is one of Amber's main stories, so I had to write this part. However, the plot doesn't progress as fast as everyone thinks. It will still be gradual. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 519. It's not that I don't want to go out with you, but I can't. Ina smiled at him and placed something in his hand. This is a parting gift, little one. It was a stack of cards. Brando held the cards in his hand, puzzled. To be honest, I don't understand. Of course, he hoped that Ina would go with him. She had not seen the outside world for thousands of years. She was smart and had no one to rely on. She would be a great help. Brando had a 90% chance of getting her to join his side. NA's strength was only slightly weaker than the pendulum golem, but she was definitely one of the strongest beings that Brando had seen so far. At the very least, she was on par with Endesha in the Calamity of Wolves. Ina smiled and did not say anything. She turned around and tied up her hair, revealing her smooth back. Between her smooth shoulder blades, Brando saw a ghastly wound. It did not look like it was caused by an external force, or rather, it grew from the inside out. What was even more shocking was that there were crystals growing out of the wound. These crystals separated the skin, similar to what he saw on the pendulum golem and the crystallized boss in the sarcophagus. What's going on? Brando was shocked. As you can see, the quartz sand below seems to have an infectious property. If you stay here for too long, the body will start to crystallize. Ina let go of her hair and turned around to look at him. She smiled and said, "I saw that young noble with my own eyes. When all his internal organs crystallized, he slowly weakened until he died. But even if he died, the crystals would not stop growing. In the end, they would become what you saw." Brando was silent. This strange symptom was similar to the half-crystallized monsters he saw in the crystal mines in the dark forest, but it was not as serious and severe. Crystallization was caused by the contamination of mana. It was like a layer of crystallized shell on the skin, but Ina said that it was more like a parasitic state. Even if the host died, the parasitic state would not end. He suddenly thought of the larvae of parasitic wasps in the natural world, but the thought made him shudder. He could not help but stop thinking about it. He was silent for a long time before he asked, "Is there no way?" The royal sister smiled slightly. Everything was conveyed without words. "There's still some time left. Let me explain the Paradise of Adversity deck to you in detail." She did not care about her situation and changed the topic. "The deck in your hand has a total of 32 cards. One of them is Echelonius's Furnace of Adversity, one Glorious Martyr, for Glorious Trumpeter, for Rising Spirits, for Lightning Storms, one Accelerated Thinking, for Furnace of Nightmare Constructs, 6 Death Sentinels, one Enrolled Holy Ring, one Cannon of Life for Daybreak, and one Impasse Trojan. You should be able to see that this isn't the complete Paradise of Adversity." The complete Paradise of Adversity no longer existed. It was sealed underground and used to construct this huge array. What the wooden head and I used was nothing more than a projection of the laws. To put it simply, only on this magic array can he and I be considered a planeswalker. That's why you asked us if we were planeswalkers. She shook her head. "We're not planeswalkers. We're not even apprentices like you. It's this array that gave us the ability to use cards. Both of us have half of the authority. It's the pitch black adversity, and I have the paradise of pure white. However, the deck in your hand is a physical existence. It's the legacy that the master left for his successor. Although it's not complete, it contains the most basic cycle of the Paradise of Adversity deck. As long as you have this deck, I believe that one day, the Paradise of Adversity will appear in your hands." "Then the cards of fate that appeared in the tomb outside were purposely placed there by you?" Brando suddenly thought of this and asked. "It's not entirely intentional. The pendulum golem and I will not leave this hall. But I think it was about 100 or 200 years ago. A few grave robbers entered this place. I purposely let them steal a few cards, hoping to attract a real planeswalker. However, the wooden head didn't seem to agree with my actions. It ordered Lederer to kill the grave robbers." She thought for a moment and answered. Brando thought of the scene outside. He could almost confirm what Ina said. However, although the pendulum golem killed the grave robbers, it didn't order Lederer to take back the cards. This meant that it wasn't completely against Ina's plan. It just had its own considerations. If it wasn't for this, Brando believed that he wouldn't have appeared here today. The doubts in his heart were slightly explained. He nodded his head and listened to the dear demoness continue. Helene continued to explain the Paradise of Adversity card deck. She said, "Every card deck has its core strategy. This battle strategy varies according to each planeswalker's thinking. Some planeswalkers prefer to attack. Their deck can often become extremely powerful in a short period of time. For example, they can use some direct attack spells or quickly summon an army of creatures to suppress the enemy. However, there are also planeswalkers who prefer to attack only after the enemy strikes. Their deck is good at control. They use the advantage of defense to achieve victory. These types of decks are more stable. They are invincible before defeating the enemy. However, the Paradise of Adversity is a little different from the other two. It has the ability to quickly attack, but it also has the ability to defend and counterattack." At this point, Ina couldn't help but feel a little proud. There are 2 cards in the Paradise of Adversity, the Nightmare Forges and the Lightning Storm. The Nightmare Forges have the attributes of both divine creatures and spirit figurines. They are treated as inanimate objects on the field and are immune to all instant death effects. Furthermore, the cost is very low and can be quickly used. The Lightning Storm spell can duplicate a lightning ball for each Nightmare Forges on the field. The more Nightmare Forges there are, the stronger the Lightning Storm spell. The Nightmare Forges can also self-multiply and quickly form into a large scale. Nightmare Forges, Paradise of Adversity 9. 1 Dark, Treasure, Divine Creature Nightmare Spirit Figurines Level 26 Creature. Effect: pay 1 light to duplicate a derivative of yourself. In every little container there is a real soul wailing. Lightning Storm, Paradise of Adversity 6. 4 Energy, Spell, Instant. Effect: tap all Nightmare Forges on the field. Target a target and deal 5 true damage to each Nightmare Forges. Enter the graveyard after using. Fire. Commander of the Acronia Army, Thailand. This spell usually takes effect within a few minutes, and in fact this is not its full power. Aina was a little proud. You're lucky? Only the Paradise of Pure White card can provide enough light elements for the Nightmare Forges to self-multiply. Also, the owner did not seal the Anxiety Disease card into the magic circle. Otherwise, with the repeated casting of the spell, the Anxiety Disease could quickly duplicate dozens of lightning storms on the field at the same time. This is the true killer move of the Paradise of Adversity. Brando broke out in cold sweat when he heard this. He had seen the Pendulum Golem repeatedly cast the lightning storm, and it was terrifyingly powerful. But now, he realized for the first time that the Pendulum Golem did not have the Anxiety Disease card in his hand. He could imagine what would happen if the Anxiety Disease duplicated dozens of lightning storms on the battlefield at the same time. This is the first killer move of the Paradise of Adversity. But this killer move is the same as other fast attack cards. It has an obvious weakness. Firstly, the spell can be easily countered. Secondly, the Nightmare Forges are too weak. Once this killer move is countered, the Paradise of Adversity will enter the Paradise of Adversity. The Dear Demoness continued, because the Desperate Trojan Horse is one of the core cards in the card. It was prepared for this counterattack. The Impasse Trojan Horse's function is to filter out 4 creature cards from the player's deck and remove them from the battlefield. When there are more than 40 non-black creatures on the field, the creature cards that were removed from the battlefield will be placed back into the battlefield for free. You might think that it's not worth it to trade 40 for 4, but think about it. What if the 4 creature cards in your hand are expensive and powerful, like the Eternal Trauma? Aina smiled mysteriously. That's why the Paradise of Adversity has 2 moves, one at the beginning and the other at the end. Each of them is a sure kill move. My master used this card to become one of the top figures among the 13 Planeswalkers, second only to Tumen, Odin, and a few others. Impasse Trojan Horse, Paradise of Adversity I. 25 Dark, Treasure, Artifact. Effect: this card must be tapped into the battlefield. Inspect your deck. Search for 4 creature cards from your deck and remove them from the duel. Then shuffle your deck. Tap, pay 40, 0. This card has 40 counters. After this card enters the battlefield, for every non-black creature on the field that dies, remove a counter from it. When you remove the last counter, use it without paying the spell cost. Place the card that was removed from the battlefield into the battlefield. Opportunity lurks in the midst of the storm, hope lurks in the midst of despair. Brando listened attentively. He had never thought that the cards of fate could support each other to form a battle strategy. The cards he received were all scattered, without any pattern. Sometimes, he used the Planeswalker system as a summoning system, but he did not expect there to be so much knowledge behind it. But at this moment he caught onto a problem and asked, "You said that the Impasse Trojan Horse can only be cast when more than 40 non-black creatures die on the battlefield. Then when we fought with it before, it was to prevent the number of Nightmare Forges from increasing, right?" "Of course," Aina sighed. "Are you an idiot, kid? The only non-black creature in the pitch-black realm of adversity is the Nightmare Forges, and the Nightmare Forges themselves are considered spirit figurines. Simply put, they are already dead. As long as there are 40 Nightmare Forges on the battlefield, the Impasse Trojan Horse can be cast. This is the power of the Impasse Trojan Horse. When the Nightmare Forges trigger a lightning storm, they can also trigger it at the same time. Then if we kill the Nightmare Forges, wouldn't they be considered as having died on the battlefield?" Brando asked again. "Death is death, destruction is destruction. Have you ever seen a dead person die again?" Brando suddenly understood, but he rolled his eyes at Ayane's ridicule. Who was born knowing these things? The Planeswalker system itself was very strange. But at this moment he thought of another problem. The Paradise of Adversity's combination of black and white seemed to be very powerful, but it was still not a match for Tumen. He could not help but think of the first time he met Tumen. He did not feel that he was that strong. He thought for a moment and could not help but ask, "Is Tumen that strong?" Aina looked at him and said, "Of course Tumen was one of the top planeswalkers at that time. I don't know much about his all-in-one, but the power of the Radiant set of the 5-color cards is unimaginable. You have seen the core card of the Alliance of States, the Golden Battle Flag. You have to know that most of the summon creatures in the Alliance of States card set are in group form. With all kinds of alliance effects and the Golden Battle Flag, do you think this card set is just average? You have to know that this is only Tumen's defensive card set. His 5-color cards complement each other, just like the black and white of the Paradise of Adversity. As far as I know, there are not many planeswalkers who are a match for his card set." Damn. Ayane's words made Brando curse in his heart. The Golden Battle Flag card was indeed a bit overpowered. He was speechless when he thought of how such an overpowered card was only used for defense in Tumen's 5-color cards. It was as if the benevolent-looking old man in the underground auction house had suddenly become taller and bigger. However, when Brando was speechless, Aina continued, "Also, don't be happy too early. Although the Paradise of Adversity has a basic cycle, there are still a few flaws in this card set." "You mean the lack of strong creatures is why the desperate Trojan horse can't be used?" Brando immediately reacted. Kelsey had the Eternal Wound, but he didn't have the ability to seal the rules of this thing. "Well, this is only one of the problems. Strong creatures can be slowly collected. But second, you lack the means to filter cards because the Paradise of Adversity's 2 core artifact cards, the Grimoire of Life and the Desperate Trojan Horse, each only have 1 card. How to find them from the deck to your hand depends on luck. In fact, your Golden Battle Flag is the same. Third, you lack a stable means to pick up Graveyard. You have Graveyard Resurrection and Archangel, but these are not enough. Archangel can only be used to maintain the number of living cards. After all, they can only be reset into the game once a day. Graveyard Resurrection will be attached to the revived card and can only be used once. To put it simply, you lack the conditions to carry out the graveyard cycle on the battlefield. Most of the spell cards in the Paradise of Adversity will enter the graveyard after being used once. Most of the creature cards also involve the effect of sacrifice. The Desperate Trojan Horse requires a dead card. This means that your graveyard will maintain a considerable number of cards during the battle. If you can't fish out these cards at the right time, you will lack the ability to last. Lastly, your land cards are far from enough. Because land cards are the core power of a planeswalker, they are usually not easily given to others. For example, I won't give my master's land card to you. It is now the power that maintains the operation of this magic circle. So you have to find a way to expand your elemental pool. As far as I know, your current elemental pool is barely able to operate the basic cycle of the Paradise of Adversity cards. Do you understand?" Aina lowered her head and asked. Brando nodded. The last time Tumen taught him these things, he didn't have much time and didn't explain many things in detail. However, the advice that Aina gave him was undoubtedly precious. Some of them were also deeply felt by Brando. For example, he never felt that he had enough of the land cards. The two of them talked for a while. At this moment, the digging sound above was getting clearer and clearer. It was so clear that it interrupted their conversation. Brando suddenly stopped. He realized that the time to leave was very close. He calmed down and thought for a while. He couldn't help but ask again, "Are you really not going out, Miss Aina? This place doesn't have any restrictions on you. I can ask someone to help guard this ancient tomb outside. The wound on your back is not completely incurable. At least I know of a miracle that can heal it. Remember, little guy, planeswalkers don't believe in gods because they are the masters of their own destiny." Aina smiled and patted Brando's shoulder, "But I am very satisfied that you can think this way. Speaking of which, I should be the one thanking you. But at least for now, I will not leave this place. There is not much time left. I can answer one last question. Do you have any other questions about the fate of a planeswalker?" Brando was silent. He looked into Ayane's eyes and knew that he couldn't convince her. He thought for a while and asked, "How can I become a real planeswalker?" "If you want to become a real planeswalker, it is not easy. First, you must have your own rules." Aina looked at Brando and became serious. "I heard you talk about the concept of your card deck. Although I don't know what dominating all classes means, but since you are starting from your own ability, then you should have as few creature cards as possible. Maybe you should think about your card deck from the direction of abilities and magic. This is my suggestion. For a planeswalker, having more cards is not better, and having a bigger territory does not make you stronger. The most important thing is still your own rules. Among the many planeswalkers I have seen, there is no lack of people who have countless cards and land cards, but in the end, they were unable to leave the apprentice stage and enter the ranks of official planeswalkers. My master became an official planeswalker at the age of 45. He is considered to be the most talented planeswalker in history. Little guy, I hope that you can reach this step as soon as possible. Consider it my wish. At this point, the dear demoness couldn't help but smile. Thank you. When Brando whispered this sentence, there was the sound of sand and stones falling from above. The two of them raised their heads and looked in the direction of the tunnel. They saw the Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord Ropar coming down with a trident in his hand. His stooped tall body looked a little funny in the narrow cave, but Brando thought that with the vampire girl Andrique's personality, she would never come down to inform her master. Sure enough, Ropar stood on top and bowed slightly to him, saying in a low voice, "The Shire has already dug a passage, my lord." Brendel turned back to look at Elaine. He could see the determination in her eyes that held a hint of a smile. "Go," Wuxia said with a smile as if she was encouraging him, "the paradise of adversity will go further. Take it with you, and one day, I hope that after countless years, there will be someone who will be able to tell you about my master's legend. Don't let me down, little one." Brando pursed his lips. "I know of a place that has a similar crystallization disease." Brando thought of his past adventure in the Amber Sword, but he was not sure if there was a connection between the two, but he still said, "I will find a way to go there and find a solution. Because you are right, Ms. Ina, you have to take your fate in your own hands." The female deer-bodied demoness smiled without saying anything. After Brando finished, he turned and nodded to the Lizard Man Lord and was ready to leave. But he didn't expect Ina to call him from behind. "Wait a minute." Brendel felt the deer demoness take a step behind him, and he thought she had changed her mind. But when he turned around, Brando was shocked to see Ina, who was almost a head taller than him, suddenly lowered her head and bit his mouth. He didn't have time to react at all, and a pair of cold lips pressed against his. At that moment he and Ina were face to face, eyes to eyes, as if they could touch each other's innermost souls. Brando was surprised and Ina was teasing him. Not only that, she also used her strength to force his mouth open. The tip of her tongue slipped in instantly, and as if a tremor, it licked the tip of his tongue and entwined with his tongue. Brando couldn't dodge in time and was completely caught. He could only passively smell the sweet, goddess-like scent of the other party. At that moment he was not only shocked but also out of his state. Brando wasn't shocked that he was kissed, but that he was kissed by force, this hateful female bandit. His male chauvinism instantly gained the upper hand. Of course he couldn't let this woman take advantage of him. He hugged her waist and wanted to fight back, but he didn't expect that the dear demoness had already slyly retreated and looked at him with a smile. "Then I'll wait for your good news, little guy. This is the reward that we agreed on earlier. No matter what the outcome of the wooden fish head is, thank you for fulfilling my wish. Now we're even, but I'll be waiting for your next favor. I'll be looking forward to it," Ina said with a smile. What made Brando angry was that this woman actually stuck out her tongue and licked her lips, as if she hadn't had enough. "Miss Ina. You?" Brando stared blankly at the other party and for a long time he couldn't say a word. After being stunned for a while he finally reacted and turned around. With a dark face, he said to the Lizard Man Lord, "You didn't see anything?" "Yes, my lord." Ropar, the Lizard Man Lord, seemed to be very honest as he replied, "I won't tell the county." "Damn, if I didn't say it, you were going to blabber?" Brando suddenly sweated. "Also, this bastard tell the county what's going on. Shouldn't they hide it from the Roman? How fond of gossip was that fellow in the Shire?" Brando suddenly felt the need to properly discipline his mage servant who had too many strange ideas. However, he could vaguely hear Orthlis gritting her teeth as she scolded him. "Shameless. Brando, go wash your mouth before talking to me. Cards that have already appeared will not appear again. Glorious Martyr, Paradise of Adversity 4, 32 Light, Creature, Glorious Descendant Monk, LV 52 Creature. Effect: sacrifice the Glorious Martyr to restore the user's maximum HP. Life is eternal. Radiant Trumpeter, Paradise of Adversity 7, 10 Light, Creature, Glorious Descendant Trumpeter, Level 39 Creature. Tap, pay 1 dark and choose a creature card from the holder's hand to enter the field. When the Glorious Descendant Hadzo blew the horn on the battlefield, the ancient spirits fought side by side with them. Glory, Paradise of Adversity V, 4 Energy. Spell, Instant. Immediately resets all Eclonia cards that are tapped. Enter the graveyard after use. Glory moves forward with high morale. The soldiers will never retreat. Death Sentinel, Paradise of Adversity v. 15 Light. Creature, Eclonia Spiritual Terracotta, *, Creature. Effect. There is no limit to the number of Death Sentinels on the field. Place 10 Death Sentinels into the field. Add a black creature with the status of Spiritual Terracotta for every corpse on the field. The level of the Death Sentinel is equivalent to the number of swamp land cards the holder has, x5. In the depths of the soul, the flame still burns, symbolizing the flame of vengeance. Sacred Tome of Life, Paradise of Adversity 2, 25 Light. Treasure, Divine Item. Effect. Every time the holder uses a spell, restore 10 HP and 10 stamina for the holder and all creatures and allies on the field. Move the Sacred Tome of Life out of the battlefield and shuffle all the cards in the graveyard back into the deck. After the Sacred Tome of Life is moved out of the battlefield, there are 30 counters on the card. Every 24 hours, one counter will be removed from the card. When you remove the last counter, shuffle the Sacred Tome of Life back into the deck. The Sacred Tome of Life cannot be destroyed. If the Sacred Tome of Life enters the graveyard, shuffle it back into the holder's deck. To this day, no one has been able to guess who created this supreme treasure. Daybreak, Paradise of Adversity 12, 1 light and 1 dark. Spell, instant. Effect, add 6 light to your mana pool. For every breaking dawn in your graveyard, 3 darkness will be added to your mana pool. Enter the graveyard after use. Daybreak, the light shines. P.S. I wanted to post it separately, but this is actually a continuous content, so it's not convenient to do it separately. I might as well post it together and the word count will only increase. That's all for today. I'll update earlier tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Jianghu to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 520. Generally speaking, the busiest time of the year for Ampere Seal was from March. But from February onwards, the north thawed, and the merchants would pack up goods from the south and ship them to Corvado and Cipher, which had just recovered from the harsh winter. Furs, amber and tobacco from Randner, pine nuts, and wood from Grimoires were all gathered here at this time of the year. As for Tonajul did not have any specialties, and the merchants only cared about whether the gold in their pockets increased or decreased. No one cared about what the poor villages produced. Most of them were bandits and robbers. It was said that before the winter last year, several fleets loaded with food were transported into Tonajul. From Ampere Seal to the Bunasan, everyone who heard the news had the first reaction of doubt. How could the country bumpkins have the money to complete the trade? Of course, not many people knew that Tonajul also owned one of the 3 silver mines in Erewhon. But then again, the silver mine belonged to the Lord, so what did it have to do with them? Even children knew this. In short, before the merchants could confirm whether the news was true or false, news of the rebellion and war in the south came again. Not only were there bandits and robbers, but even the rebels had appeared. This proved that Tonajul was a place of barren hills and turbulent rivers. In the eyes of the nobles, the old saying that barren hills and turbulent rivers produced unruly people was as accurate as a maxim. But most of the pot-bellied nobles enjoyed the furs and spices from the south, and when they wore jewelry from the mountains, they did not need to know where they came from. Although Erewhon was facing internal and external difficulties, and the north and south were shrouded in the shadow of war, the merchants were the most informed group of people. Because of this, most of the commercial activities had come to a standstill. But the area between Ampere Seal and Eterin was the economic core of the kingdom, the free trade port, and the permanent neutral zone promised by the Holy Cathedral. Gold was still flowing slowly like blood. In Omitos, Festin was the closest outpost to Ampere Seal port. Surrounded by mountains, the chill in the forest had yet to dissipate. The pine trees had just shaken off the snow on their needles, and the icy water from the thawing of Arek's green mountains formed a gurgling stream that flowed through the forest. A group of riders passed through the forest, and birds flapped their wings and flew from the branches on both sides of the road, dropping a few feathers. Maynard was patrolling the area with her knight subordinates. Most of the first batch of Knight Academy sergeants were now able to hold their own. Behind her was Freya. Half a year ago she was still a country girl, but now she was wearing a knight's armor. Her face gradually gained the dignity of a soldier, but she still tied her hair up like before. The mark on her forehead from the last competition was still there, but it had faded a lot. She wore the Lionheart sword at her waist. The princess had told her not to draw it unless it was necessary, so she used an ordinary steel sword. The knight girl with two swords looked a little funny, but Freya did not feel that there was anything wrong with it. In the militia, every sword was a precious asset. If possible, she would probably carry a few more swords as if it would give her a sense of security. In fact, it was the same mentality as people who were afraid of being poor would save their money whenever they had the chance. However, the knight girl at least understood that it was ridiculous for a knight to carry 5 or 6 swords. Besides, horses would not be able to take it. During the training period in the academy, everyone could receive a new sword every month. This was because the intensity of the training was too high, and there were not many people who were willing to take care of their swords seriously. Most people would change their swords in a year. However, every time Freya received a sword of her own, she carefully stored it in a box under her bed. Now she had 6 swords. This was an old joke in the academy. When Maynard found out about this, she called her over and gave her a good scolding. Freya was frightened. She honestly admitted that she wanted to give these swords to the militia when they returned to Wuxia. This way they would be able to better protect their homeland. After hearing this answer, Maynard was silent for a while. In the end, she did not say anything. The Valkyrie from Wuxia continued to do as she pleased, preparing for her militia. This matter was quite famous in the academy for a period of time, and even the princess had heard a little bit about it. However, when Freya was recognized by the Lionheart sword, no one mentioned it anymore. Today, Freya's expression was slightly nervous. This was the first time she had left the academy to carry out a mission so far away from the academy. Although she had gone through real battles in Wuxia, when she thought about how an insignificant existence like herself had to bear the heavy responsibility of protecting the princess, the future goddess of war felt a little nervous. She always felt that the wind and grass in the wind were enemies. Beside her, although Maynard was also very serious, she was calm. The knight's sharp gaze pierced through the forest like an arrow. Finally, she realized that something was wrong. She looked at Freya, then looked again. Finally, she could not help but ask, "Freya, what are you doing?" The girl reacted and hurriedly replied, I'm here. Is there anything to be nervous about?" The knight asked unhappily. I didn't. Her voice was trembling. The riders all laughed softly. Breton could not help but shake his head in amusement. He was someone who had killed his way out of Wuxia with Brando and Freya. Although he did not take the same route as Brando, the guards had also killed their way out. In Wuxia he used to like this girl, but in the end he realized that her thoughts were not with him. Now, after the training and growth, the two of them were just comrades. Even his hostility towards Brando had lessened a lot. After so many things had happened, Breton felt that he had matured a lot. The superficial competitiveness of the past seemed a little childish now. It was as if the passion of youth had turned into another kind of hidden emotion. It had become deep and stable and was connected to the fate of the kingdom. Beside him, most of the youths had the same thoughts. The knight laughed softly, and even Maynard could not help but find it funny. The knight's expression softened slightly. She did not know why Freya looked so frightened in front of her, as if she would eat her up at any time. She shook her head and said, "Freya, you are a soldier. You need to learn to be calm and collected. This is just a routine patrol. If you really go to war, won't you be so nervous that you won't be able to walk?" The knight laughed again. "If I really go to war, I won't be so nervous." Freya hurriedly nodded her head, but she was criticizing in her heart. Unexpectedly, Maynard seemed to have seen through her thoughts and said, "That's true. Unlike the others here, you and Breton have seen real battles. But there's nothing to worry about. Her Highness is very safe. This is a neutral zone promised by the Holy Cathedral. No one dares to start a fight here." "Then why do we have to go out on patrol every day?" A knight did not understand. "This is to maintain the basic vigilance of a soldier. If a soldier cannot sense danger, then the kingdom we protect will be in danger." Maynard turned her head and replied coldly. The knight was slightly startled, as if they had just understood. But Maynard turned her head and looked at the forest in the distance. There was no war here, but the real war had just begun in another place. Behind the layers of forest, Viscount Ding's villa was located in a secluded valley. Magadal had used her connections with the Holy Cathedral to arrange for the royal faction to stay here and receive the generous hospitality of the owner. This place was far away from the bustling city, and was like a different world compared to Ampere Seal. The nun princess knew what kind of place her close friend liked. Besides, under the current circumstances, she also felt that Griffin needed some peace and quiet. Griffin indeed needed some peace and quiet. She silently watched from behind the window on the second floor of the villa as Duke Arek's carriage passed through the gate and slowly stopped in the courtyard surrounded by pine trees. This was the first meeting between the two parties and it was related to the fate of the kingdom. But to put it nicely, she could not really control the fate of the kingdom. To put it bluntly, it was not up to her to decide. Griffin lowered her head, and the tips of her silver hair fell past her ears and down to her cheeks. She was not old, and a layer of cute fine hair could be seen at the edge of her face. But it was on this pair of delicate shoulders that she had to bear an unimaginable burden. Griffin took out a letter from her bosom and carefully read it before putting it away. I don't know what you are resisting, but I am willing to do my best for Erwin and people like you. You are the one who gave me confidence and strength, Mr. Knight. Duke Arek's envoy had arrived late. The arrogance of the nobles made her deeply aware of her own weakness. But anger would not help. This was not an era that could be changed with just a wish. Griffin knew that she had to give up something. She turned around and ordered her maid, "Tell Arek that I don't want to see him today." But the maid was a little afraid. Griffin had never been willful since she was young. Although she did not understand the politics of those big shots, she knew that the decision of the princess at this critical juncture would deeply anger some people. She could not help but carefully persuade her, Lord Fleetwood, Lord Makarov and the others. But Griffin looked at her coldly. There was no trace of willfulness or dissatisfaction in her silver eyes, only calmness. Arek's envoy comes and goes as he pleases. Does he not care about the dignity of the royal family? I don't mind meeting him, but if this is his attitude, then there is no point in this negotiation. Tell Count Makarov what I said. From today onwards I will not see Arek's envoy for a week. She paused. A week later we will meet in the city of Ampere Seal. When she finished this sentence, the childishness in her seemed to have completely faded away. She had become the future princess who would guide the fate of all the players in Erewhon. The regent princess of Erewhon. The fate of the kingdom seemed to have begun to walk on the original path at this moment. I am a little stuck today, but I still persevered in writing a chapter to keep it running. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 521. Ampere Seal was shrouded in a strange atmosphere. Far away in the south, Tanajil was also shrouded in a similar atmosphere. After returning to his territory, Brando immediately called for an emergency meeting. The meeting was held in a forest not far from New Valhalla. The tree elves had planted a square there that was surrounded by 10 ancient banyan trees. Brando was quite fond of that place, so he temporarily used it as a meeting place. Because he had informed them beforehand, he had gathered almost all of his core members, including those who had followed him since Fortress Reden. Gaspard, Terran, Mano, Reto, and Batum were all members of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group. Even though Gaspard was the captain of the Fortress Reden's security cavalry, he had also joined the group since Fortress Reden. Only Terran was a little special. He was originally the sergeant major of the White Mane Infantry Regiment, but because of various reasons he joined the group. In the eyes of the world he was a traitor. Brando stood under an ancient banyan tree and looked at these people. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. There were a few familiar faces in the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group that he couldn't see anymore. A few of the older members had passed away due to illness during the long migration, and most of the remaining members had died during the Second Tanajil War. However, the will of the dead seemed to have been passed on to the living, and the remaining people had become stronger and more resolute. This change was obvious. Gaspard used to be the lackey of the nobles in Fortress Reden. When he first appeared in front of Brando, he was a pretty boy who looked strong on the outside but was weak on the inside. But now, because he had been outside for a long time, his skin was slightly tanned, and his face and arms were covered with battle scars. Even though he looked a lot rougher, he also looked more mature and stable. Among the refugees who migrated from Fortress Reden, there weren't many of them, because not everyone was willing to leave their homes. Most of the people who knew this captain of the security cavalry hated and feared him, but now there were more and more people who took the initiative to stop and call him captain. But the most important thing was his strength. In just a short year he had grown from a weak iron-ranked character to an iron-ranked one. It wasn't just Gaspard. Most of the people who came out of Fortress Reden were the same. Terran, Mano, Redbeard Batum, and Reto were the same. In just a few months, their strength had shown signs of breaking through the peak of iron-ranked and entering the silver-ranked. The sea of magic was changing the world, but only those who had experienced life and death situations could clearly feel this change. Brando's gaze swept past the people in Fortress Reden and landed on another group of people, the Grey Wolves mercenaries. These people who were abandoned by Makarov and taken in by him hadn't been with the mercenaries for long, but many of them had increased their strength to varying degrees, including Sanford. After the distribution of the dragon blood potion, his strength had increased to the upper iron ranked. In fact, Amandina wanted to give priority to the seniors in Fortress Reeden, and the others would observe the situation. But Brando felt that it wasn't necessary. Those who had followed him through 2 wars were loyal and reliable. In this era, it took courage to go against the nobles. If Makarov and Grodin didn't force these mercenaries into a dead end, they wouldn't have followed him to this point. Although the production of the dragon blood potion was not high, it was obviously more convincing to distribute it based on merit rather than seniority. Besides, most of the people who followed him in the earliest batch were also people who were extremely loyal and contributed to the group. Brando used this point to convince Amandina and win the hearts of the people. Even though the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries received the most dragon blood potions, at least the others could see that everyone had an equal opportunity in this group. Even the latecomers had a chance to surpass the seniors in the group. As long as one's hard work was rewarded, they would be filled with motivation. Brando's action was to maintain the vitality of the mercenaries. He had been the leader of the Amber Sword for a period of time, and had a certain understanding of modern organizations. Compared to the nobles of this era, his vision was naturally much more advanced. In the eyes of this noble lady from Bragg's, her lord's suggestion had an astonishing effect that she didn't expect at all. The people's hearts were more stable and cohesive. This change was within her expectations, but she could faintly feel that there was something more in the mercenaries. Like a soul, everyone became more motivated. The new members were working hard and the old members felt a sense of crisis. Even she was affected by the atmosphere and became more energetic during the day. This change was subtle and it formed a virtuous cycle in the ABs. Amandina, who had learned about the arts of the emperor from the ancient inheritance of the Nesson family, was secretly shocked. She knew that this kind of atmosphere was something that many nobles and even monarchs couldn't achieve, but her lord seemed to have done it with just a wave of his hand. Amandina thought about it carefully. Even though she had always been conceited, she couldn't help but admit that she couldn't do it. She always had to consider loyalty and not justice. She felt that she couldn't understand why Brando could always ignore this point. Was her young lord not afraid of nurturing talents for his opponents? It was a common thing to change sides in this era, and almost all nobles had a headache over how to maintain the loyalty of their subordinates. But Brando never cared about it, and his mercenary group was the most loyal and cohesive one she had ever seen. Brando's reply to her was, "If you have a fair and good system, why would you worry about the people in the system going elsewhere? Loyalty isn't because of praise or favoritism, but because the group is worth it. I am confident that this group is the best choice for those who follow me. I maintain this system and the others are loyal. It is because I have such confidence in this group that everyone can trust and rely on it." Amandina didn't quite understand Brando's understanding, but she still remembered the calm and confident manner her lord had when he said this sentence. She had never seen such calmness and confidence in any noble before. "If they come, I will welcome them. If they leave, I will not stop them." She felt that perhaps only such a mind could create such a unique group with such charm. It was a group where everyone, even someone as vile as Gaspard, could find a place for themselves. Amandina slowly walked into the banyan tree square with these thoughts in mind. She couldn't help but raise her head to look at Brando, who was not far away, and happened to meet the young lord's gaze. "There are more and more girls around, my lord. Even the boys like Mephistopheles look cuter than me." Amandina didn't know why, but a strange thought suddenly flashed through her mind. Her heart that had calmed down because she didn't want to compete with the little Roman began to fluctuate inexplicably again. Maybe there is a chance. Brando was half leaning on the banyan tree, and when he saw Amandina enter, he couldn't help but smile. Of course, he noticed Amandina's gaze, but he only thought that she was reminding him to pay attention to his appearance as a lord and a noble of the kingdom. He could almost imagine Amandina's tone when she said this, and when he thought of Amandina's serious look, he couldn't help but smile. Amandina was always so serious, but there was also a special kind of cuteness in it. Brando couldn't help but comment on the girl, but he quickly reacted and hurriedly shook his head to throw this thought out of his mind. It seemed that ever since he was kissed by the dear demoness who had the same name as the goddess of fate in the tomb, something strange in his heart became restless. Speaking of which, the current Brando was only 19 years old, almost 20 years old, and Sophie in his previous life was still a high-ranked sorcerer. Therefore at this moment he was still somewhat ignorant of the feelings between men and women, and was filled with the curiosity of a teenager. He patted his head to clear his mind, and his gaze moved from Amandina to the others. At this moment the people on the field entered one after another, and almost everyone was present. Brando only then noticed that his subordinates had unknowingly formed such a large group. Scarlet, Mephistopheles, Medisha, and the new vampire girl Andrique were beside him. A little further away there was Ropar, the Shire and its Fireclaw spearman, as well as the Fire Djinn who was communicating with a group of wind spirits and light spirits. These guys were all creatures of the elemental realm, and although they almost didn't interact with each other in this realm, they could still be considered to have a common language. Then there was Kodin, Karglais, Maria, and the young officers of the White Lion Infantry forming a circle. These people's experiences in the dark forest had cultivated a comrade-like relationship with each other. The two pristine archangels stood together with the Roman. They were now almost exclusively the Romans' personal bodyguards, and the aura of death on their bodies had disappeared. In fact, on the way back, Brando had summoned the Book of Life and Death, and removed it from the battlefield to retrieve all the cards from the graveyard. Currently, the Book of Life was on cooldown, and the graveyard resurrection cards were also removed from the attached state and returned to the deck. Brando did this mainly to prepare for the trip to Ampere Seal, but he also knew that he might not be able to use the Book of Life for the entire trip to Ampere Seal. But after weighing the pros and cons, the cards in the graveyard were more important. Although the Book of Life was the core card of the Paradise of Purity, but in reality after the Paradise of Adversity was combined into one, the Book of Life only strengthened the defense of the deck on the field. As a planeswalker, Brando actually had many ways to restore his HP. At the very least, the various types of holy water that he obtained from Amon in the Dimensional Cave were probably the first in history. At the very least, that was the amount of supplies that Amon had prepared for an army. Further away were Rabin, Yuta, Cornelius, and their subordinates. They stood together with the Nightsong Tiger and Rocco of the Mercenaries of Lopez. On the other side were the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries. Lastly, the villagers of the Green Village stood together with the Druids and Tree Elves. Sifred was like a fish in water in that circle. She had been living with her father for a while, and Brando did not want her to be estranged from her family and the villagers because of the Druids. Brando raised his head. There were still subterranean dwellers in the forest. Tajiv was doing well under his command, and the subterranean dweller had expressed his willingness to submit to him several times. The subterranean dwellers were not looked down upon like the subterranean dwellers. On the contrary, many people who were loyal to the subterranean dwellers treated them as protectors. Before the Tree Elves joined, the subterranean dwellers were indeed Brando's strongest force. It was not easy to meet these people in the forest. Amandina was in charge of agricultural production in the Maxen region, but she rarely appeared in the ABs. The winter crops in Tanajul were growing, and Brando knew nothing about it. However, Amandina was an expert. The agriculture in Wonde relied on magic, and the wizards and monks of the Holy Cathedral played an important role in it. Fortunately, the monks of the Holy Cathedral would not work for the rebels. Fortunately, Brando had the Druids under his command, and they were far better at farming than the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But when these people gathered together, Brando realized that his wings were slowly growing. He could not help but count. Scarlet, Mephistopheles, Medisha, and Ropar were 4 gold-ranked wizards. There were also the Shire and Andrique, 2 gold-ranked wizards. Kodin and the Fire Deity were also lower gold-ranked wizards. Including himself, there were a total of 9 gold-ranked wizards, and this did not include the Tree Elves and the Druids. In terms of numbers alone, they were second only to Aween's Duke Arek and Duke Cypher, who were renowned dukes. Brando remembered that there were a total of 22 gold-ranked wizards serving the royal family of Erewhon. However, not all of them followed the royal faction of the south, and some of them joined the king's eldest son, House Cypher's camp. In other words, the royal family only had a dozen or so gold-ranked wizards. This could be said to be the strength of Erewhon's country, and they were not much stronger than him. In terms of quality they were inferior. Brando's gold-ranked wizards, except for Kodin and the Fire Deity, were all middle-ranked and above. Medisha even had the strength of an upper gold-ranked wizard. After Scarlet converted the dragon bloodline, she reached the pinnacle of gold-ranked wizards. After the trap vampire received the sacrifice, he was Elemental Awakening, and was only a step away from breaking through the elemental barrier. In Wonde, Elemental Awakening was recognized as the strength of an elemental wizard. Further down, the silver and iron-ranked wizards were also fully fledged. Brando counted 3 of them: the Mercenaries of Lopez, the Pristine Angels, the Fireclaw Spearman, Karglais and his little lover, Maria. Then there was the Mercenary Corps and the Tree Elves Alliance that came out of the Black Forest with him. There were hundreds of them, and the leader of the Fireclaw army, Vern, had reached the pinnacle of silver, and was about to reach the strength of a gold-ranked wizard. It was worth mentioning that Brando's own Garuru rock beasts had hundreds of silver-ranked black wolves, which were also a hidden force. Below the silver-ranked, the red-bronze dragon mercenaries were the main force, and a large number of iron-ranked wizards formed the backbone of the army. Below them were Uriel, the old dwarf Odin, the wind spirit drake, the cave dwellers and the shadow beasts. Even the alchemist Tamar had recently reached the strength of an iron-ranked wizard. Other than a few who acted cute and were purely civil servants, such as Roman and Amandina, Brando's forces were almost full of talents. The only shortcoming was that they lacked the highest level of combat power. The princess's side at least had Buga and Fleetwood who were elemental awakened, and the hidden elemental awakened power of the royal family of Covardo would definitely be more than that. As for the duke's side, Arek had 2 elemental awakened retainers, the duke's army in the north had 3, Viro had 1, and Karsuk had 2, one of which was a wizard. Compared to these forces, Brando's top combat power was a little lacking. Other than the Ash Sword Saint, but Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was still not considered a member of his group after all. If Brando wanted to win the battle at the elemental awakened level, the only thing he could think of was the golden battle flag. Although there were many restrictions, as long as he placed it on the battlefield, he would at least have the strength to contend with Erwin and the other dukes. At this time, the noisy scene had quieted down. Everyone was present, and everyone's eyes were looking in this direction, waiting to see what this exceedingly young lord wanted to say to suddenly gather them. At this time, Brando recovered from his thoughts. His gaze slowly swept across the audience, and in a short moment, his thoughts became clear again. First, let's talk about the recent events. Brando first looked at Amandina. What he wanted to say next was about the trip to Ampere Seal. But it was not time yet, and he needed to prepare. This matter was related to the entire group and the future of the territory. Brando thought that it was time to let these people who followed him understand his thoughts. What was Erwin's future? He did not know how many people would agree with this, but after a period of subtle influence, Brando also wanted to see the results. How many people had the same ideals as him, and how many people wanted to save this ancient kingdom that had once written its glory on its flag? My sword points forward, the first generation of nobles of Erwin trace back the ancient glory, and advance along the path of the ancient sages. King Eric, P.S. 2 days ago I stopped to organize my thoughts about Ampere Seal. Brando will definitely go to Ampere Seal to change history. After all, this is the goal he has been preparing for all this time, and it is also the meaning of his life. However, it is easy for one person to go against the huge inertia of the entire history and destiny. The difficult thing is how to bear the pressure and responsibility that comes after the change. This is what Brando has to consider as a man. The decaying kingdom is collapsing in an unstoppable manner. Can Brando protect everything he wants to protect under this collapsing edifice, and build a new Erwin from the ruins? I hope to experience this completely different future with him. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 522. Amandina nodded at Brando and walked out with a stack of parchment papers in her hands. In a sense, she was still the same cautious and calm girl that Brando met for the first time. However, there was a healthy flush to her pale face, and her thin eyebrows were slightly furrowed. She looked like she had matured a lot. She turned around and glanced at the people in the hall. Ever since we repelled Count Randner's unreasonable invasion, Amandina coughed lightly. Amandina raised her head and looked at the bad guys carefully. She did not roll her eyes like Scarlet, but her silent gaze was enough to make people feel helpless. Ferber, Port-Gris and Maxon are all doing well. All the plans and work are being carried out in an orderly manner. After the hall quieted down, she began to explain the situation in the entire territory and Aween in an orderly manner. Ferber, Port-Gris and Maxon are all doing well. All the plans and work are proceeding in an orderly manner. After the hall quieted down, she began to explain the situation in the entire territory and Aween. Overall, Abes was on a path of healthy development. The most pressing problem was the food they bought from Abes. The food they bought from Ampere Seal was enough to last them until the 4th month of the Year of the Sword. They could only count on the harvest of winter wheat, but there was a possibility that they would need to purchase more food as well. Amandina expressed her opinion on the current situation. The clouds of war were gathering in the north, and the price of food was likely to continue to rise in the next few months. She suggested that if the territory needed to purchase food, it should be done as soon as possible. Bosley, Roman, Odom, and the Shire agreed with her suggestion. Brando naturally agreed as well. He wanted to go to Ampere Seal immediately and buy a batch of food along the way. The nobles of the north and south were currently gathered in Ampere Seal under the Holy Cathedral's arrangement. They were preparing for the final negotiations on the future of the kingdom. To the commoners, this was the last hope to prevent a civil war from breaking out. The merchants were also observing the situation. Although the price of food fluctuated, only a few people were secretly hoarding it. However, Brando understood that there was no turning back between the north and the south. On the surface, the negotiations were to maintain peace in Erewhon, but under the surface, it was a final struggle for the kingdom's power. The regent princess would use this opportunity to meet with Erek and form a marriage alliance. Brando did not know much about the north, but he knew that the royal faction and Erek's diplomatic group had arrived in Ampere Seal before the nobles in the north and the eldest son of the king. Outsiders did not know much about this, but he knew that the future princess and Duke Erek were likely to be in the diplomatic group. It was just that they did not announce it to the public. Although Tonajul did not have any spies in Ampere Seal or even the north of Firth, and all the information came from the few merchant fleets in Ampere Seal that had established a temporary connection with Abes. But even without this information, Brando knew the truth behind it. This was nothing more than a prelude to history. He still had some time. Amandina continued to talk about agriculture and the spring plowing. Anyone could see that Brando wanted to expand the scale of Tonajul's agriculture. But if he wanted to increase the scale of agriculture in Tonajul, then the spring plowing would require a large amount of labor. In normal years, no one would be willing to move to such a remote area except for the homeless. Fortunately, the War of the Black Rose had created a large number of refugees. Master Bosley had already sent a letter to his students to organize these refugees to move to Tonajul. The main problem was the loss of life along the way. Brando felt sorrowful to the point that it was almost depressing. The lives of people had to be calculated like goods. This reminded him more than once of the slave trade in the history of his previous world. But in reality, if these farmers and craftsmen were allowed to stay in the war-torn homes of Viro, Karsuk and Grinoires, the end result would be nothing more than to fend for themselves. Only a small number of people would be able to survive, and the elderly and children would have no chance of survival. This was the helplessness of war, and also the reality that this world had to accept. Brando, who was half a modern person, could only remain silent when he received this knowledge. He had never paid attention to this background in the game before. It was just like how Wond only had those magnificent legends, but the NPCs were living the cruelty of this world and no one cared. There is a problem. These refugees are more or less taken in by the local nobles, but the nobles only need strong laborers and women who can give birth. The rest are mostly the elderly and children. Amandina stopped here and turned to look at Brando with her black eyes that seemed to be able to speak. There was a deep sorrow in her eyes. She spoke of the homeless as if she was empathizing with them. If not for Brando, she would also be part of the lowest class of people in this world where the strong preyed on the weak. But on the other hand, she also had a difficult dilemma in her heart that she could not bring herself to speak of. It's fine. The elderly have experience that the young cannot compare to. As for the children, Tonajul needs children. Children are the future of this territory. They have experienced the hardships of war, and only then will they understand how difficult it is to live a peaceful life. Tonajul can take them in. Brando took a deep breath. He was now a lord and there were many people standing behind him. This meant that he needed to be mature in his judgment, but maturity did not mean that he had to wallow in the mire with the nobles of this world. Brando had always believed that even if there was a day when the civilized world was reduced to a wasteland, the noble and beautiful culture created by mankind over thousands of years of glorious history would not be eroded. On the contrary, mankind would be the first to walk out of the wastelands with the light of humanity. That was just his personal opinion, but when he looked at the others, they all looked at him with respect. Amandina had an indescribable complicated expression on her face. She hoped that Brando would calmly reject her, but she was destined to be disappointed. But he also calmed her down. Even though she knew that it was a childish and impulsive decision, it was filled with a kind of power that inspired her. At that moment, she felt as if she saw a young knight holding a shining banner in the endless darkness as he advanced against the current. That kind of perseverance almost melted her heart. She wished that she could help the young man take one more step forward, so that this gentle light could exist a little longer before Erewhon's dawn. Not all the elderly have experience and there's no need for so many of them. Amandina muttered to herself and then smiled gently. I've never seen such an idiot before. Forget it, I'll help you to the end. Bosley shook his head among the crowd, but his eyes were filled with forgiveness and gratification. After experiencing a life of exile, he finally understood how far Erwin had fallen. Who would be able to save Owen? His passion as a member of the royal faction had cooled down, and he was no longer sure if the royal faction would be able to help Owen. His support for the princess's faction was due to the inertia of his past. Until today, when he saw Brando's decision, he felt that there was something in this young man that the nobles of Erwin lacked. He suddenly made up his mind and wrote a letter to a few of his proud students and old friends, asking them to come to Tanajil and see everything here. After talking about the refugees, Amandina briefly mentioned the development of the territory. There was nothing much to talk about. The white main guards were still nowhere to be seen, and the main reason was that they were far from enough. The armor and weapons workshops were also lacking in manpower, and they could not fully support an entire army. Odom's grand city was still on paper. According to him, he was running around every day like a rabbit digging holes to build forts and tunnels on a few mountains. It was as if he had seen a ghost. The Shaflund silver mine was operating steadily, and it was the main source of income for the territory. Brando's main source of income was the Dark Forest. With the help of the Druids, he could easily develop the borders of the Dark Forest. The most important thing right now was the crystal mine that he discovered. Even though the production was not high, the monthly income was faintly surpassing the silver mine. Other specialties such as alchemy materials, wood, fur, and some rare items were not important. Tamar was the only one who praised him for these things. It was worth mentioning that Tamar's alchemy level had increased to level 12. This was the conclusion that Brando obtained from the quality of the dragon blood potion that Tamar helped to create. Lastly, the main thing was the expansion of Port Gris. The small fishing port had 2 additional berths for large ships, and a new bridge was built. It was no longer the peaceful port it used to be. Its main task in the future was to maintain the flourishing commerce. The renovation of the port took a lot of manpower, but the Roman did not recruit the citizens, and instead used the method of hiring workers to complete the project. Not only did they not cause complaints like the other lords, but they also won a good reputation. The only problem with Brando's reputation in the territory was that he did not have a proper title, and the citizens were more or less worried that war would break out again. But in other aspects, the majority of the people had already recognized this wise and benevolent lord. At least he was many times more benevolent than Grodin. On the other hand, the cost of hiring workers was also recovered through food. The Roman purposely left a small portion of it among the citizens. According to her words, the small amount of money left in the hands of the hardworking would give birth to more small amounts of money, and the Roman only needed to earn it back when the time came. It was as if the money was originally in her pocket. However, Brando was rich in the territory, and Brando did not mind her doing whatever she wanted. The current situation in the territory is more or less the same. Because of the emergency in the north, Count Randner is in danger of being involved in the war with Duke Vero. He might not be able to return to deal with us for the time being. Although Erwin's situation is not stable, Tanajil will be able to gain some breathing space. Amandina paused and looked at Brendel with her eyelids slightly raised. Tanajil could be said to be thriving and everything was on the right track. Everyone present could not help but feel some hope in their hearts when they heard this. Most of the people who followed Brando were at their wits' end, and they did not think that this miraculous young man would be able to lead them step by step to a path of survival. Then again, who would have thought that this young man would be able to bring an alliance with the Druids, Tree Elves, and Centaurs from the Dark Forest when Count Randner's army was pressing on the border? Everything that had happened in the past few months was like a miracle in the eyes of everyone present. But this miracle had indeed happened, and it was right in front of their eyes. Then they seemed to have created a reality. Occupying this territory and becoming a true lord, everyone might have the identity of a retainer. They would no longer be wandering mercenaries, adventurers, rangers, wanderers, or other identities. Brando nodded lightly to Amandina. Just half a month ago, every one of us tried our best, sacrificed our sweat, and even sacrificed our blood to bring this new territory out of the shadow of war. Perhaps you all thought that we could finally take a breather and enjoy a peaceful life while the nobles were busy. Everyone nodded subconsciously. But I want to tell you that it is the exact opposite. Brando shook his head. I will be going to Ampere Seal soon. I cannot predict what will happen on this trip, but I can be sure that when I return here again, Tanajil will be involved in a real war. Compared to the wars you've seen before, the previous wars are like child's play. This war will involve the 2 largest factions in the kingdom and several dukes. Countless powerful lords with real power will fight for it. The most outstanding knight you have ever seen will only be cannon fodder on the battlefield. Every enemy you will face can crush you like an ant. And these powerful enemies are likely to join forces to annihilate us. Tanajul will be walking on an unimaginably difficult path, full of thorns, surrounded by strong enemies, and a path that the entire Erewhon will not tolerate. As soon as Brendel finished speaking, the meeting place that was surrounded by 10 ancient banyan trees fell into a dead silence, to the point where one could hear a pin drop. Everyone looked at Brando, who was standing high on the stage, but no one made a sound. "My lord." "What?" finally someone asked. Brando thought for a moment. "Because I am going to stop a person with a noble bloodline, the rightful heir of the kingdom, a true princess, from falling into a trap. For this, Tanajul will offend all her enemies, and the nobles who did not get what they wanted from the negotiation table will join forces. The war will spread to the entire Erewhon. We have no allies and can only rely on our own strength to save this crumbling kingdom." Everyone was stunned. Only Amandina, who knew the truth, simplified the sentence in her mind. "I'm going to kidnap the bride." She couldn't help but pout. She suddenly thought of something and lowered her head to look at the pendant in front of her chest. This pendant was left to her by her father. "But what do those nobles have to do with us? They have never given us any benefits. Why should we risk our lives for them?" A member of the Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but ask. Out of everyone present, these people who were once deceived by Makarov were the most distrustful of nobles. "The reason is simple. In fact, the reason why we have a foothold here is because of the princess's recognition. In name, we have taken back this land from Madara. Whether you are willing or not, if we lose this moral foothold when the nobles in the north come back, we will be their next target. That is why we can only join one side and defeat the other. Even though the chances are slim, we have no other choice." Brando answered. There was another period of silence in the assembly hall. Suddenly a voice exclaimed, "Martha above, my lord. If we help Princess Griffin defeat her brother and help her ascend to the throne, then wouldn't we have the merit of helping her when she is in danger? At that time, with the merit of our lord, it would be natural for him to be conferred a duke." Brando turned around and saw Carglass speaking with a face full of vulgarities. "My lord, if you are a duke, then us retainers will at least have the status of a baron. Ha, let's see how my old man will lecture me then. My status will be higher than his." Carglass' face was filled with vulgarity as he spoke. Maria, who was beside him, pulled on his sleeves with a red face. She was so embarrassed that she wanted to find a hole to hide in. She had never seen such a vulgar noble before, and wondered how Lord Maxon had educated him. However, Brando was secretly laughing. He could see that this young man was acting as a shill for him, but at least from this point he could see that Carglass supported him. Carglass' words caused a commotion. Why not? In front of benefits, most people would see the benefits first and not the risks later. Since they had to take the risk anyway with such a generous reward, the risks were not worth mentioning. Indeed, if they were to help the princess obtain the throne, then Carglass' conjecture would definitely come true. Everyone knew that the princess had no one to rely on at the moment. It was easy to add flowers to a brocade, but help in a time of need was precious. What happened to the first batch of families that followed the late King Eric? Erek, Cypher, and Vero, which one of them was not a real duke? Thinking of this, everyone's heart was stirred. Brando looked at their expressions and knew that there should be no problem. He knew that those closest to him would definitely follow him, and the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group's veterans from the November War wouldn't oppose him either. They were potential supporters of the king's party anyway. His main goal was to appease the remaining mercenaries. The mercenaries didn't have much faith, so he had to let them know that they were fighting for him. Otherwise, there would be trouble in the future. He nodded and replied, "Yes, that is why I want you to be prepared. The rewards will be generous, but only the final victor will get the reward. I think you all understand this without me saying it." "Of course, my lord. We understand. My lord, don't worry. With your wisdom, the princess is lucky to have your support." This was a guarantee, and it seemed that some of them were already full of confidence. "Of course, I know that most of them are just flattering me, but at least I managed to get them to be motivated." Sometimes, when the hearts of subordinates wavered, it was because they could not foresee the worst outcome. But once they knew that this was the worst outcome, then when the real war broke out, Tanajul would be able to participate in the war in the best possible condition. Brando could not help but touch his chin. To be honest, he did not have much confidence in the upcoming war. It was not that he was not confident, but the enemy was too strong. He did not tell the truth. If the plan did not go well, he might have to forcefully destroy the marriage between Princess Griffin and Erek. But no matter what, it might cause Erek to turn to the other side in anger. The best result would be to remain neutral, but if the worst happened, it would mean that Tanajil would have to face the pressure of the entire Erewhon. Erewhon was not strong, but that was after compared to Madara and Cruz. With the strength of 6 or 7 archdukes in Erewhon against a mere Tanajil, it would be like comparing the strength of an adult to a child. And when that time came, his only ally would be the pitiful help by the princess side. In fact, Brando did not have a complete solution for the time being, but he did not have enough time to prepare. He would not let history repeat itself, and the trip to Ampere Seal was imperative. At this time he saw the Shire walking up to him. He knew that the Shire wanted to tell him that the ship to Ampere Seal was ready. From Tanajil to Ampere Seal, it would only take a week. P.S. First of all, I would like to thank It's Night Wind, 10 Nights T Wind, Awutuanzi, I Am Unknown Horizon, Hemtika, and everyone else on the forum for helping me organize the information. Then I would like to correct 2 bugs. One is Koden's mid-gold rank strength, and the other is the Fire Djinn. I have a look at the Fire Djinn. It is level 45 on the card. Level 45 is the peak of silver rank, close to gold rank, so it can be counted as a gold rank. Lastly, Medisha. Although Medisha's absolute strength is only below gold rank, her combat strength is at mid-gold rank. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 523. How did it go, Griffin? Princess Magadal, who had been waiting in the carriage for a long time, asked as the princess, who was dressed in a light silver dress, stepped into the carriage with the help of her servants. Nothing much. That old fox Erek wants Haruz to go to Erek with him, Griffin replied faintly. The weather was still a little cold, so a maid at the side put a fur shawl on her shoulders. She pulled the shawl and continued, This is impossible. I will never give Haruz to him. I'm sure Master Fleetwood and Makarov will not agree to it either. Then what should we do? The delicate and beautiful nun princess had a worried look on her face. I heard that your brother's men have already found Erek. It's okay, Griffin was not nervous at all. Our Duke is just asking for too much. He knows that we will not compromise on this condition. It's just that he won't easily reveal his trump card. At the same time, he wants to know where our bottom line is. Griffin said as she looked up at the sky of Ampere Seal. Although it was close to the month of recovery in the Year of the Sword, the sky of this metropolis was still gloomy and leaden, as if snowflakes would fall at any time. Griffin sighed. We still have to talk, Teeny. In Cruz, explorers were in charge of the inland sea to the west of Erewhon and the inland sea to the south of Cruz. It was called the Shining Sea. Heading west from the fishing port of Griffin, one would enter this sparkling light blue ocean. Turning north, one would enter one of the main waterways of Ampere Seal. Today the weather was clear. A beautiful and light 3-masted ship was sailing through the waves. As it was still close to land, seagulls circled around the mast. The ship was filled with papyrus and crystal ornaments, disguised as a merchant ship from the kingdom of Rubik in the south. Rubik was a desert country at the southernmost part of the Shining Sea. It was full of exotic scenery. There was a land trade route from Rubik to the Nine Phoenix, but Brando had only been there a few times. After all, it was too far away. The ship that was sailing through the waves was called Far Away. It was a registered merchant ship in Ampere Seal. The reason Carglass was able to get such a ship was because Brando represented the AB's group and had a good relationship with the merchants of Ampere Seal. Fast. It was a fast ship, and according to the words of the men who now made a living on the sea, it was the best lad. The captain of Far Away was quite young. He was only in his 30s. Most people his age were still first officers, but on the other hand, it was a sign that he was a capable man. The young captain was like a king on the ship. He did not submit to the authority of the nobles. Coincidentally, Brando did not have the airs of a noble, so the two got along quite well. The captain was called James. Unlike other sailors, he took good care of himself, whether it was his beard or his clothes. This was probably a common problem for young people. However, this was not a bad habit. The captain liked to wear a red woolen coat and a boat-shaped hat. He hung his captain's sword on his waist and held a smoking pipe. People who made a living at sea had more or less hobbies. Brando had seen drunken captains who commanded their ships. Compared to them, the captain in front of him was a role model. In fact, he smelled a trace of a soldier's aura from the captain. He was strict and meticulous. After asking around, he found out that the captain was actually a descendant of a prestigious family. His ancestors all held positions in the kingdom's navy. Although his generation had already turned to business, that kind of temperament that he was familiar with since childhood could not be changed. The two stood at the side of the ship and watched the sea gradually become more and more blue, gradually showing a trace of deep purple. It had been a day since they entered the shining sea. Gradually they could not see the shadow of the continental shelf. After another 1 or 2 chains, they would be completely in the deep sea. When night came they could no longer see the seagulls on land. This was a common sight for James. Although he was only in his 30s, he had been on this route for 20 years. From a sailor to a first officer, he had only recently become the captain. In terms of experience, there were not many people on this ship who could compare with him. Brando did not appear to be surprised. He was knowledgeable and had seen even deeper oceans. When it came to strange stories of the sea, he could tell more than the most experienced sailor. Beside Brando stood Amandina, a noble lady who was almost pale as she looked at the endless sea. She was born in the southernmost mountains of Erewhon. She had only heard of the existence of the sea in her father's notes. When she first saw the sea in the fishing port of Gree, she was still able to maintain her composure. But according to the words of those who had been on the sea for many years, the sea you saw on land was completely different from the sea you saw on the sea. Once you were on the sea, you had completely handed your fate over to this sometimes gentle and sometimes cold goddess. Even when she was at her most gentle, the waves on the sea were like undulating mountains. The large and sturdy 3-masted ship that was anchored in the harbor was like a small boat in the middle of the vast ocean. Those who had little experience in sailing would often be frightened to the point that their legs turned to jelly when they boarded the ship for the first time. Amandina's performance today could be said to be brave. She was like a Roman who was full of energy and curious about everything on the ship. But now she was dizzy and weak and ran to her room to lie down. The merchant lady once complained loudly that Brando had tricked her into joining this pirate ship. But Brando told this little cutie that if she wanted to become a great merchant, it was impossible for her not to get used to the wind and waves of the sea. In the end, she could only bury her head in her pillow and groan a few times. "I think I'm starting to understand my father a little, my lord." Amandina stood at the side of the ship, looking down at the white trail left by the ship on the blue sea. In fact, she was also not feeling well, but when she thought that her lord was still on the deck as an aide, she could not leave alone, so she gritted her teeth and endured. Brando turned to look at his quiet aide. Amandina was like all the noble ladies of Erewhon who were born into a noble family. She was full of a kind of intellectual demeanor, but she was different from all of them in her strength. "Before I came out with my lord, I did not know that the outside world was so vast and beautiful, and it was so moving. Although I have seen the scenery described in my father's notes, I only understood today that if you were not there yourself, you would not be able to imagine how tempting it is to explore it. Just like now, when I stand here and look at the intersection of the sky and the sea in the distance, I can't help but think about what is on the other side of the sea." Amandina could not help but press down on her hair that was blown away by the sea breeze. This action gave her a weak and youthful charm. "I think my father also thinks so." Brando heard that Amandina's tone was a little faint, and he knew that she was thinking about her parents who had passed away in her hometown in Grenoires. For a moment he was a little dazed. Yes, he was also drifting. He had his own family in this world, but they did not belong to Sophie's half. He was not prepared to return to that place, and he did not know how to face it at the moment. Amandina's self-pity was because she was homeless, but he had a home that he could not go back to. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but ask, "Do you blame him?" Amandina shook her head. "I don't know, my mother would occasionally complain. But I feel that I should understand him because I was born into a noble family, and I should be more sensible than other children. But it was one thing to think about it, but later on, I found that I still resented him in my heart." She sighed faintly. "No matter how beautiful the scenery in this world is, it can't compare to his wife and daughter. How I envy the children in the neighborhood, even though their family background is far inferior to mine." Brando looked at the girl's side profile and asked, "Does your father know about your talent in creating the magic transmission core?" "I think he knows. Although he rarely comes home, he often brings me some incomplete documents. I feel that he still cares about his daughter, but maybe the direction is not quite right." Brando touched the grayish-brown stone in his bag. Ever since he saw the magic quartz sand in the underground hall, he felt that this thing might be related. "I think you're right. He cares about you, but everyone has a different way of expressing their feelings," Brendel said softly. Amandina raised her head slightly, her dark eyes looking at Brando with some doubt. At this time, Carglass came up with a young officer of the White Lion Guard. Although this young man had never been on a ship before, he seemed to have an innate talent to accept new things in the shortest amount of time. In just half a day he could walk on the deck as well as the most experienced sailor. Even Captain James was surprised and praised him for being a natural sailor. Of course, James was also surprised by Brando's knowledge. Brando was too embarrassed to say that he had a few years of experience in the sea. How old was he? His experience was too much, and he could only lie and say that he had seen some of the mage's documents. Knowledge from books was completely different from actual experience, and this did not escape the young captain's eyes. But a mage's item was always a box for a normal person, and anything could be stuffed into it. Furthermore, Brendel's mage servant was obviously a Highland wizard, so his suspicions were barely dispelled. As for the young officer beside Carglass, his expression was not good. Even after the battle at the Gree River, Brando had never seen such a depressed expression on the young officers' faces. These brave young men could defeat even the most terrifying enemies, but in the face of nature they had to retreat. The quality of your men is really good. I've seen many soldiers in Ampere Seal and Karsuk, but I've never seen such outstanding young men. At this time, the captain suddenly turned around and pointed at Carglass and the young officer beside him with a pipe in his hand. Indeed, although the young men were trembling in fear, compared to ordinary people who went to sea for the first time, they were already outstanding. Still far from it. Brando shook his head. This time he brought the most people with him to Ampere Seal, the future White Lion infantry. All 40 young men made up almost 2/3 of the entourage. Brando had high hopes for these young men. He hoped that they could go through some hardships with him in the future. In the end, everyone who stayed behind could become the backbone of the future Erewhon. Of course, these young men might not understand this yet, but no one doubted that it was a bad thing for their lord to bring them along. Young men were the age where they were full of passion and drive. No matter how strong the enemy was, they would still dare to challenge it. This was the story of a newborn calf who was not afraid of a tiger. But thanks to the captain, I brought a lot of people this time. In addition to the camouflaged goods and the necessary food and water, the captain's cargo was much smaller. Brando quickly added. This time he brought a lot of people with him. Because Ampere Seal involved business matters, the Roman had to come along. Brando did not trust her to go alone, so he brought along Amandina. Moreover, Amandina was the person who was most familiar with Erewhon nobles. She was also smart, and her presence would be of great help to his goal. Next was the mercenaries of Lopez. This was a prophecy. Brando had joked that he would bring Amandina, Falerne, and the rest to Ampere Seal to broaden their horizons. Now that there was an opportunity, he would not be the first to break his promise. Moreover, the mercenaries of Lopez were experienced and there was no possibility of casualties. They could guide the young men of the White Lion infantry during the operation. Next was the Shire. The Shire was his mage attendant, and he had to go as a cover for his identity as a Highland knight. The rest were Ropar, Mephistopheles, Andrique, and Medisha. This trip to Ampere Seal to destroy the marriage alliance was full of danger to Brando. Although he was in the dark and the enemy was in the light, Brando knew that there must be other people who did not want the marriage alliance to succeed. The royal faction and the Grand Duke would definitely take precautions, so in terms of combat power, Brando would not mind having too many. Finally, there was Scarlet. This girl was almost like Brando's shadow. She rarely spoke, but she never left Brando's side. Although the aftereffects of the blood of God were almost impossible to recur after absorbing the golden apple and the dragon's blood, she still could not leave Brando's side for the time being. Brando had said before that he would let her go after her injuries were healed, but seeing her in this state, he could only keep his mouth shut. At the same time there was an unexpected guest. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles did not inform anyone about Brando's plan. According to him, it was to ensure that his contractor and half of his students would not die in Ampere Seal. However, even if Grey Sword said that he was going for a sightseeing tour, Brando believed that no one would dare to object. After all, Grey Sword's strength was obvious. On the other hand, the old swordsman, Coden, was not willing to take the initiative to participate in his affairs because of Count Randner. Otherwise, there would be another strong person in the gold faction. And it was just these people that filled up the entire ship. And this was the result of Brendel keeping the Fireclaw Spearmen, Wind Spirit Spiders, Fire Djinn, and Holy Angel cards that were more conspicuous. One had to know that a normal merchant ship would only have the necessary sailors, and it was impossible for it to be filled with soldiers like a warship. But in reality, even though Faraway looked like a merchant ship on the surface, it was actually a warship, except for the fact that it did not have any cannons. In response to Brando's words, the young captain smiled and replied, "You're too serious, my lord. It's just business." There was one more thing he didn't say, and that was that Trentheim didn't have any specialties. Even though the Lord had promised to open up a new trade route for them, James didn't really believe in this promise, at least for now. Their merchant fleet only came here because there was business to be had. Merchants did not care if the other party was a bandit or a rebel. As long as the other party followed the rules and did not drag on the settlement of the goods, they would be the best customers. Besides, James had a good impression of Brando. Others said that these people were bandits and rebels, but he could see that Brando was a polite noble. Even though his way of doing things was a little strange, he unexpectedly left a good impression on him. James was also full of praise for Brando's subordinates. He had seen many noble subordinates in private armies, but he had to say that the temperament and spirit of these soldiers in Tanajul was not inferior to the kingdom's regular army. Perhaps even more so. The young captain thought for a moment. Probably only the knights of the royal family that he had seen before had such a spiritual appearance. When he came to Ampere Seal, he was only a captain and an ordinary merchant. But now that he had returned to Ampere Seal, the young captain began to feel a little curious about Brando and his subordinates. In his opinion, this young man might not be as simple as he appeared to be. He could not help but think that there might be a possibility for them to further their relationship in the future. Thinking of this, the captain put down his pipe and knocked on the side of the ship. At this time, Carglass and his officers came to Brando's side. There was a problem with the computer yesterday, sad. Who knows what the problem is with the computer when it opens the browser? If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 524. My lord, there seems to be a problem, Carglass whispered into Brando's ear as he and the young officer approached. Brando turned around. Carglass and the White Lion Guard on duty today were patrolling the cabin to ensure the safety of the cargo. Brando brought along the first batch of White Lion armor that was jointly made by Master Bosley and Tamar. These armors were different from the White Lion armor used by Erwin's royal family today. With Brando and Orthless design input, these armors were more similar to the original White Lion armor that King Eric had modified. The White Lion armor was derived from the Wind Elves' White Winged Knight's armor, the half-plate of the Wind Empress. However, after using human craftsmanship, the White Lion armor was far inferior to the latter. King Eric had modified the White Lion armor and the White Lion battle tactics. In the early days, the White Lion swordsmen were also known as the White Lion Guards. Erwin had a large number of documents that said, "The king led the knight to unify the southern border." The king here referred to King Eric, and the knight referred to the White Lion Guards. The White Lion Guards and the Silver Elves Temple Guards were once the two core forces of Erwin. Legend has it that the White Lion Guards were close to grade 4, and were only slightly inferior to the White Winged Knight. However, when the Cipher dynasty was destroyed, King Eric's modified White Lion battle tactics had been lost. Much of the information on the White Lion armor's forging method had also been lost. Even Brando and Orthless could not complete the lost information. However, as the saying goes, every warrior is half a blacksmith. Although the two knew nothing about the original White Lion armor, they knew the half-plate of the Wind Empress like the back of their hand. The half-plate of the Wind Empress was a very popular armor in Erwin in the game because of its high defense and flexibility. Most importantly, there were quite a number of half-plate of the Wind Empress that entered the kingdom in history, so it was not rare. Brando was lucky enough to get his hands on such a set of armor. As for Orthless, she was a knight of the Wind Empress, one of the higher-ups of the Wind Elves. She knew some of the secrets of the Wind Elves like the back of her hand. Even if the two could not complete the design of the half-plate of the Wind Empress, they should be able to make a set of it. The White Lion armor was a new set of the half-plate of the Wind Empress. The half-plate of the Wind Empress was more similar to the half-plate. However, thanks to the special enchantments of the Wind Elves, the half-plate of the Wind Empress was not inferior to the original in terms of flexibility and flexibility. The wall of wind on the half-plate of the armor could block arrows from a distance of 100 meters. It could also reduce the effect of swords and sabers to a large extent. It would be difficult for a medium iron warrior to break through the half-plate of the Wind Empress without using their full strength. In the current Erwin, at least a warrior with some strength could wear the half-plate of the Wind Empress and fight against 10 enemies without any problems. Furthermore, the half-plate of the armor had enchantments for agility and moisture removal. Even if the wearer wore the half-plate of the Wind Empress for a long time, the wearer would not feel tired easily. Of course, all of this came with a price. It was a bad habit of the players to use all of their best materials when forging a piece of equipment. In the end, when the price was calculated, Brando was stunned. The half-plate of the Wind Empress cost tens of thousands of tor. Even with Brando's current wealth, it was impossible for him to equip the White Lion Legion with such a ridiculously expensive item. In the end, after a compromise, he decided to equip the half-plate of the Wind Empress with the half-plate of the Wind Empress. As for the ordinary infantrymen, they would use the half-plate of the Wind Empress. As for the half-plate of the Wind Empress, Bosley was currently thinking of ways to remove some of the most expensive parts, such as the magic crystals and magic arrays. According to the old man's estimation, he would be able to produce results by the time Brando returned from Ampere Seal. Brando was well aware of Bosley's little scheme. He was probably trying to see how he would express his stance on this trip to Ampere Seal. Would he be on the side of the princess or the other side? Bosley wanted to see if he would stick to his words. Brando did not feel that there was anything wrong with this. After all, no one would trust another for no reason. Besides, Bosley's expectations did not conflict with his own. In fact, Brando did not think that there would be any problems with the half-plate of the Wind Empress. Ordering someone to inspect the half-plate of the Wind Empress was just a matter of routine. When he heard the other party's words, he was slightly stunned. However, the young officer continued, Jettel heard a strange sound in the lower cabin. It seemed to be coming from outside the cabin. Brando thought to himself that it was indeed not a problem with the half-plate of the Wind Empress. He turned around and looked at James with a questioning gaze. The lower cabin of the Faraway was filled with cargo and ballast. If there was a strange sound, it would most likely come from outside the cabin other than rats. If it was rats, there was nothing to worry about. However, if it came from outside the cabin, then there was a problem. Sound did not travel as well as it did in the air. Furthermore, there was a layer of the ship's planks. To be able to hear the sound, it was either something very close to the ship or something very large. Which side? The young captain immediately asked. Brando looked at his subordinate. Carglass immediately replied, it should be the port side. The young captain reacted quickly. He immediately turned around and waved his hand. Throw the crystal chain to the port side. Not far away, a sailor saw his gesture. He ran over and pulled out a rope with a crystal-like object tied to it. With a plop, he threw it into the sea on the left side of the Faraway. Brando recognized that object. It was a special kind of sound-sensitive magic crystal. If there was a source of sound near, it would vibrate. There were many magical creatures in the open sea. Sailors often used this thing to determine if there was a sea monster lurking below the ship. It was said that experienced sailors could determine what kind of creature was approaching based on the frequency of the crystal chain's vibration. However, the sailor obviously did not have such an ability. As soon as he threw the crystal chain, he could not help but exclaim, "There's something down there. There's a lot of it." Sound the alarm. Prepare for battle. The young captain's face turned serious. The sea was calm, but the ship was surrounded by unknown creatures. Obviously, they had a certain degree of intelligence and were up to no good. However, Brando's reaction was the fastest. Before James could say anything, he had already rushed over and cut off the rope in the sailor's hand. The sailor was stunned for a moment. He saw something under the sea pulling the rope with a whoosh. The strength of the thing under the sea was amazing. If not for Brando's help, the sailor would have been dragged down with the rope if he let go a little slower. The sailor was so scared that his face turned pale. He even forgot to thank Brendel. However, Brando looked at the side of the ship and said, "It's a humanoid creature." Among the magical creatures in the shining sea, there were only a few that had humanoid characteristics. Other than a few murlocs, there were the merfolk and nagas, and there were also the lizardmen pirates. However, the lizardmen pirates would not stay in the water, and the merfolk rarely attacked humans. If it was not a murlocs, then it was a naga. James did not believe that the young lord could identify the enemy in the sea with just a glance. However, it was a fact that there were enemies under the sea, and they had already shown signs of attack. A sailor ran to the mainmast and sounded the alarm. The sailors below the deck quickly rushed up. The Faraway was a large ship. There were 40 sailors on board, plus the first mate, second mate, captain, and navigator. Brando also ordered his own officers to call the officers of the White Lion Regiment. As a result, the deck was packed with people. Brendel's expression was much calmer than the young captain's because he knew the strength of his ship. The Faraway was comparable to the kingdom's main warships that were below the third rank. Any pirate group that dared to provoke such a ship would be asking for trouble. Brendel stared at the surface of the sea, but his mind was suddenly reminded of the famous British submarine hunting ships from another period of history. He did not know if the current Faraway was a warship disguised as a coal transport ship. However, its nature was slightly different. At this time, black shadows appeared on the surface of the sea. Triangular fins broke the surface of the water and formed a white wave. Brando knew at a glance that it was a shark. There were at least 16 or 17 tribes on the surface of the shining sea that drove sharks to hunt. The sea people taming sharks was as common as the people on land taming wolves. Just by seeing a shark they could not be sure of its identity. James had the same idea. He put his pipe in his bag and pulled out his sword to the side of the ship. But at this time, a melodious song sounded from the sea. It's the sirens. The young officers of the White Lion Regiment were fine, but the sailors screamed when they heard the song. The sirens were mythical creatures. Legend had it that they used their soul-sucking songs to lure ships astray. In the Epic of the Cruise People, the sirens were described as banshees with a human face and a bird's body. However, Brando knew that they had nothing to do with the harpies under Georgandy Ridge. The real sirens were genuine mythical creatures. Their upper bodies were female, and below their knees were birds' claws. They were more beautiful than any woman in the mortal world. Not to mention, their beautiful voices could make anyone who heard them lose their soul. There were all sorts of descriptions in the myths, and all of them said that after the soul was taken away by siren, the ship would drift on the sea all day, until it turned into a ghostly ghost ship. Most of the people who lived by the sea grew up listening to such stories, so the sailors were scared out of their wits when they heard the song. On the other hand, the country bumpkins under Brendel were much calmer. Put on your earplugs. James immediately ordered. Most of the sailors were very superstitious. Even though no one had seen the sirens for hundreds of years, the legends were enough to make the people who lived on the sea prepared. He immediately took out earplugs that he had prepared beforehand and plugged his own ears. The sailors followed suit, but the officers of the White Lion Regiment were also prepared. They took out their earplugs one after another. Brando had many years of experience in the sea and had gone deep into the sea. He was naturally more familiar with the things on the sea than James. However, he did not say anything to stop the young captain's orders. The beautiful song seemed to penetrate his brain, causing him to fall into a trance for a moment, but he quickly regained his senses. This was not the song of a siren. He turned around and handed his earplugs to Amandina. Amandina glared at him coquettishly. Everyone was afraid of the siren's soul-sucking song, but she did not believe in it. She did not like his actions that did not care about his own safety. Almost everyone present saw that the young lord did not put in his earplugs, but was unmoved by the song. They could not help but be surprised for a moment. They knew that Brando was a Highland knight, and all of them thought that it was a mystery that belonged to wizards. However, they did not know that Brando's willpower was frighteningly high. Not to mention that this was not the song of a siren, Brando thought that even a real siren would not be able to seduce him. He turned back to the captain and said, "It's not a siren, it's a mermaid." What? The captain was wearing earplugs and thought that he had misheard. "It's a mermaid," Brando said firmly. "The Nagas are under the sea. I know that the mermaids of the shining sea often move with them." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 525. The Nagas in the Shining Ocean were quite famous. They often attacked passing merchant ships along the route from Ampere Seal to Grey Haven and even Lubeck. However, the Nagas in the deep sea were not united. They were divided into more than 10 different tribes, the most famous of which were the Quatones and the Shining Scale Nagas. The Quatones were not only in the Shining Ocean, but also in the 7 seas of Wonde. They were the most notorious bandits in the ocean. In comparison, the Shining Scale Nagas had their own culture, language, and traditions and were more like a kingdom. Most of the tribes in the deep sea made a living by raiding, and the Nagas were no exception. Dozens of tribes attacked each other, but it was just a dirty fight between bandits. There had never been a day when they fought so fiercely that the merchant ships on the route did not suffer because of it. The sailors were not as fearful of pirates as they were of the mythical sirens. Brando's reminder woke everyone up. But it's strange. The mermaids rarely come out with the Nagas to raid merchant ships. Even so, Captain James still asked in confusion. He pulled out his pipe and extinguished it before stuffing it into the pouch of his coat. He then drew his sword with his right hand and ordered the sailors to set up the shields by the side of the ship. "Be careful of the javelins," he added. In the Amber Sword, the mermaids were loyal to the Nagas. They often participated in the wars between them, using their magical voices to win battles for their allies. To put it bluntly, they were like bards on the battlefield, but the battlefield here was shifted from land to the deep sea. Mermaids were typically kind creatures. They usually refused to join the Nagas in raiding merchant ships of humans or dwarves. 1. However, It was not surprising for one or two unusual creatures to appear in such a large tribe. At this time the creatures in the sea surfaced. They looked similar to humans, but their skin was blue. Their shoulders, arms and backs were covered with erect fins. They also had cheeks from their cheeks to their necks. They also had nasal cavities. They could breathe through their lungs and filter the air through their cheeks. However, for the Nagas the air on land was too dry, and they were not used to living out of the water. The Nagas did not have hair. Instead, beautiful sky blue bundles of nerves replaced their hair. At first glance, it looked strange, but once one got used to it they would find it beautiful. Most of the Nagas that surfaced from the water were males. They had 2 pairs of arms and no obvious breastfeeding organs. Their faces were sharp and defined, and they were covered with battle tattoos using a special non-soaking dye. Their muscles were firm and they looked like strong human males. However, Brando knew that it was because their lower bodies were hidden underwater. According to legend, the Nagas were the descendants of the sky serpent. They were all half-human, half-snake monsters. The Naga males had 1 less pair of arms than the females. This was because the Naga gods wanted the females to be more agile than the males. The males only needed to be on the battlefield, so they needed to be more powerful. However, these were all myths and legends. In reality, the Nagas and mermaids were good at throwing spears. The male Nagas had 2 pairs of arms. 1 pair of arms held the trident that they were good at, while the other pair was good at using short swords and shields. The mineral resources under the sea were rich. They did not have to worry about iron and copper, which were commonly used to make weapons and armor. The Nagas knew how to use underwater volcanoes to smelt and forge weapons. They also had special methods to protect their weapons underwater. Therefore, they were not inferior to the humans on land in terms of weapons. However, the biggest difference between the weapons and armor of the Nagas and humans was the shuttle-shaped shields. This was a specialty of the Nagas. It was used to reduce resistance underwater. Seeing that the mermaid's seductive voice did not work, the Nagas floated up to the surface and used their most common tactic. They threw spears at the deck of the Faraway like rain. Unfortunately, Captain James was experienced and had already ordered his men to erect shields. The shields used on ships were actually double-layered tower shields that were commonly seen on Won's battlefields. They were usually hung upside down on the sides of the ship, and when needed, they could be pulled up with ropes. The steel spears hit the thick shields like raindrops, but to no avail. The shields on the ship were specially designed to deal with these common robbers. The Faraway was a large ship, so it was even more well-prepared. The Nagas' spears were either embedded in the shields or fell powerlessly into the water. After a while, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, the Shire, Andrique, Scarlet, Mephistopheles, Ropar, and the Silver Fairy Princess also came to the deck. Seeing these people, James finally let out a sigh of relief. Although he did not know the full strength of this young lord beside him, he knew that at least Medisha and the Shire had the strength of a gold tier. With 2 gold tiers in charge, even the flagship of Erewhon's fleet could not compare. "What's going on?" Mephisto asked calmly as he walked out of the cabin and saw the monsters on the surface of the sea. Captain James did not know that this ordinary-looking middle-aged man was Brando's biggest boss on this trip. However, just this calmness alone was enough to make him take a second look. The Ash Sword Saint's calmness was not without reason. After all, this was the beginning of the Year of Swords. It was not like the end of the Slate War where the bandits on the road could be elemental awakened. At this time, not to mention Erewhon, even when Mephisto's duchy was still under Cruz, he was still one of the top fighters in the Empire. For a fighter of his level, as long as he was careful, it would be difficult to find any existence in the entire Wone that could kill him. And a few Nagas were not a problem at all. "It's the Nagas," Brando replied. He held his sword and did not immediately attack. He looked at the Naga warriors on the surface of the sea and felt that they were somewhat familiar. Although the Nagas looked similar to humans, there were still differences between different tribes. For example, the Shining Scale tribe was named for their colorful scales. The tribe Brando looked a bit like the Grey Fin Naga. When he saw the pale scales, he could not help but be slightly startled. Could it be that coincidental? These are the Nagas? The Ash Sword Saint had heard of the Nagas before. But he was born in the interior of the Empire and had been fighting against the Empire all his life. He had never taken a ship out to sea, so he had only heard of the Nagas but never seen them. He looked at the monsters and could not help but be slightly startled. He turned back and said, "Why do you always run into trouble wherever you go?" Brando did not expect this serious guy to ridicule him in such a serious manner. But only he would have the leisure to do so at a time like this. But he did not expect Orthless to nod in agreement. "I think this guy is right. You always run into trouble wherever you go." Mother Marcia above, I'm innocent too. Brendel was speechless. When he was in the Amber Sword he could not obtain any storyline quests, but after transmigrating to this world, he had to be careful at every step. Inexplicable things kept coming to him one after another. But Orthless was just joking. It was very common to run into pirates at sea. Not only were there pirates but there were also bandits and bandits on land. Most of the feudal lords' management of their territories was limited to the core area. The more remote the area was, the more chaotic it would be. In the outer seas where no one could control, it was a paradise for illegal forces. At this time the sailors began to fight back. Most of the ships sailing on this route were armed merchant ships, so there was no shortage of weapons on board. The sailors fought back with crossbows but their attacks were not very accurate. Instead of saying that they wanted to destroy the enemy, it was better to say that they could only force the enemy to retreat. In the midst of the chaos, the sailors under James suffered quite a bit. A few spears pierced through the gaps between the shields and into the crowd, injuring several people. 2 unlucky men were nailed to the deck. The second mate, who was also a doctor on the ship, took a look and said that they could not live. But Brando took out a few bottles of the lowest grade holy water from the Dimension Cave and asked Medisha to pass them over. The amount of holy water he got from Amon in the Dimension Cave was astonishing. Not to mention low-grade holy water was not very useful to him, so he could use it to buy a favor. Brando knew that it would be very beneficial for his future development to have a good relationship with these merchants of Ampere Seal. Not to mention James himself had a strong background. Holy water was the most effective medicine in the world. Its greatest use was to stop bleeding and repair damage to the body, and injuries in war were basically of these 2 types. As long as the person did not die from excessive blood loss, holy water could play a role in reviving the dead. But it was not common. During the Holy War, the Holy Cathedral could only supply it to the most elite troops. When the 2 sailors who were about to die drank the holy water, their terrifying injuries immediately healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. At that moment, not to mention the second mate who was in charge of treating the wounded, even James was stunned. Although his sailors were not very important, and who did not have their heads on their waistbands and did not care about life and death, it was a miracle to be able to drag someone who was about to die back from the hands of the Grim Reaper. Captain James was born a noble and had seen many things. He immediately understood what Brando's medicine was. He was not surprised by Brando's ability but Brando's generosity. Using something like holy water on a sailor he did not know was either too benevolent or too magnanimous. Seeing this scene, James hesitated for a moment. For the first time, as a noble and a merchant, he began to consider whether he should deepen his relationship with Abes. He glanced at Brando and thought to himself, perhaps the rumors are true. He came from a great family with deep roots. But why would he appear in Tonagel and go against Count Randner? With his keen nobility he immediately thought of the civil war in the north. The royal faction? Or the princess's personal knight? Could it be that the Highland Knight in Karsuk is starting to support the princess's faction? Several thoughts flashed through the young captain's mind. Compared to the captain's complicated thoughts, the 2 sailors who were saved from the hands of the Grim Reaper only had gratitude in their hearts. These sailors were actually from poor families. If not for the fact that they had nowhere else to go, who would want to become a sailor? Sailing in this era was an extremely risky endeavor, and the mortality rate of sailors was relatively high. According to Brando's understanding, it was only slightly better than the 15th or 16th century in history. Saving these 2 sailors was equivalent to saving the lives of their families. But even so, Brando did not accept the sailors' request to kiss his boots to express their gratitude. As a person from the modern era, this was extremely awkward for him. But in the eyes of others, this only served to accentuate the young lord's breadth of mind. Brando did not know that his subconscious actions had won him a great reputation among the sailors. At this moment, the future officers of the White Lion Legion had already taken out a batch of heavy crossbows from the bottom of the ship. These crossbows were not ordinary crossbows. To an iron-ranked warrior, a 4-armed crossbow was no longer sufficient. Brando ordered Grandmaster Bosley to create a batch of crossbows that were enchanted with magic for the White Lion Legion's officers. These weapons were shockingly expensive, and every single one of them was as heavy as gold. Fortunately, Brando only needed 50 of them. Brando intended for the future White Lion Legion to use magic bows instead of magic bows. Magic bows required a small magic conductor, and this was Amandina's area of expertise. Even though the technology was complicated, the price would be several times cheaper. Of course, this was still a distant dream. Before that, the White Lion Legion could only use ordinary bows to make up the numbers. Brando did not have the money to prepare a magic bow for every soldier. Besides, he felt that if he really did so, the Roman would definitely give him a headache. The moment the officers of the White Lion Legion joined the battle, the situation on the battlefield immediately changed. In this world, perhaps even in the entire Erewhon, there was no other lord who invested as much money as Brando in training his soldiers. Brando's knowledge came from the modern era, and he knew that an army was nurtured. In his training program, he strictly required the soldiers and officers to be trained in actual combat. This caused Bosley and Amandina to complain more than once that the amount of money spent was unimaginable. Replenishing arrows, repairing weapons and damaged armor, this expenditure was more than 10 times that of the other lords in Erewhon. In response, the master from the palace angrily said that if the money was saved to buy an army for the princess, it would at least be able to recruit an army on the same scale as Brando's. However, Brando stubbornly insisted on it, and his persistence finally paid off today. The officers of the White Lion Legion were like seasoned soldiers who had been on the battlefield countless times. Even their only flaw of not seeing blood was fixed during the Wolf Wave. Their performance right now made even the most elite knight in Erewhon feel ashamed of his inferiority. Although they were more experienced in battle, they were far inferior to the White Lion Legion in terms of teamwork and training. The arrows of the White Lion Legion sergeants were so accurate that it was as if they had eyes. This was the result of countless shooting practice sessions. The arrows that each of them used were worth tens of thousands of Tor coins if converted into gold coins. However, all these gold coins were now found on the bodies of the Nagas. Captain James could not believe his eyes. The officers of the White Lion Legion killed one enemy with each arrow, and in just a few breaths, more than 10 Naga warriors were shot to death and sank to the bottom of the sea. The sharpshooters of the navy were only SOSO. The Nagas on the other side also felt the pressure. They never dreamed that a merchant ship would have such firepower. This was obviously a warship. Even the third-level battleships of the kingdom did not have such firepower. The only difference was that this merchant ship did not have cannons or crossbows. Otherwise, they would have thought that they had collided with a real warship of the kingdom. The two sides exchanged blows for a while. On the White Lion Legion's side, there was only one officer who injured his hand because he broke his crossbow. He became the only casualty on Brando's side. On the Naga's side, there were already more than 10 corpses. The initial shock of the Naga warriors on the sea had turned into fear. They let out a shrill cry and retreated one after another. They retreated just like that? The captain and Brendel were stunned. In their impression, the Nagas were extremely brave and good at fighting. Even if they suffered a setback for a short period of time, they would continue to fight without fear of death. They had never seen a Naga turn around and run the moment their attack was blocked. Were these really the Nagas? Could they be the fishmen in disguise? Brando and James looked at each other for a moment. Generally speaking, in Vaunt, only two races, the humans and the dwarves, were keen on commercial trade, and the most common merchant ships at sea were also the merchant ships of these two races. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 526. The sun cast a golden glow on the surface of the sea, and the battlefield returned to its usual calm state. After the last Naga dived into the deep sea, the surface of the sea was only shimmering. It was as if everything that happened before was just an illusion. If it was not for the faraway damaged side, everyone would have thought that it was just a nightmare. However, the retreat of the Nagas was not a sign of retreat. Look! A sailor suddenly screamed. Brando looked up and suddenly saw that under the deep blue sea, a huge shadow had appeared out of nowhere. The shadow lurking under the water was much bigger than the faraway. Compared to it, the small three-masted ship was like a leaf. The shadow passed under the faraway at an extremely fast speed. Everyone felt a terrifying tremor coming from the hull of the ship. The rivets on the mast and the ship's planks were struggling, as if they were about to jump out of the wood, making a sound that made one's teeth ache. Brando's gaze quickly moved from one side of the ship to the other. He pursed his lips and did not say a word. The shadow under the sea was a message that made one uneasy. In the seven seas, a creature of this size could only be a terrifying sea monster that existed in legends. The huge shadow swam into the distance and then it began to rise faster. The huge shadow arched the surface of the sea, and the water rushed along its huge back to both sides. Then a sharp horn pierced the surface of the water, forming a white trail. Oh my God! What is that? The sailors panicked. Any ordinary person who saw a small mountain rising from the sea would be scared to death. Moreover, everyone present knew that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Captain James gripped his sword and thought of a terrifying possibility. His face turned pale. That's a demon whale. An adult demon whale. Brando answered first. Are you sure you're not mistaken, Mr. Brendel? James gasped. I want to be wrong, Brando could not help but answer. Oh, Martha. The captain couldn't help but mutter. It was not because he was too timid, but because the demon whale was the most terrifying legend passed down by the people of the sea. Legend had it that it was one of the most terrifying monsters above the seven seas. Even in the great library of White Harbor, a city of 1,000 cities, its figure could only be found in the oldest documents. From generation to generation, the older sailors passed down the terrifying rumors of this monster. It was said that only the most unfortunate or lucky people could see its true appearance. However, those who could survive after encountering the demon whale could only be said to be favored by the goddess of luck. In the myths of the Won Cruz people, the demon whale was the descendant of the great sea dragon Dagon. They were born to be the kings of the sea. Fishermen said that they could control the storm, but at the same time, they were also the symbol of a bountiful harvest. In the area of the 10 cities, the harbor often used the demon whale as a common decoration. People hoped to use it to calm the storm and bring fish and a bountiful harvest. However, encountering such a monster on the sea was the greatest misfortune. Even the most powerful human warships were just toys in front of it. An adult demon whale's pure physical strength was even stronger than a real dragon. Ordinary spells and weapons could not hurt it at all. On the contrary, the magical power in its bloodline could overshadow the most powerful wizard. At least Brando knew of a few stories where the demon whale completely destroyed a harbor with the power of a storm. However, seeing the appearance of this monster, Brando felt more confident. This demon whale is obviously on the same side as the Nagas. Our firepower is too strong. It seems that they don't dare to attack us. He turned back and said, Mr. Sword Saint, we are counting on you now. A Sword Saint? The captain and a few sailors beside Brando clearly heard the conversation between the two. For a moment they thought that they had misheard. At this time of the year, there were actually 5 people who could be called sword masters in the entire kingdom of Erewhon. They were Buga the Cross, Devard the Eagle, and Sylvia the Silver Knight. These 3 people were born in the Erech province. The people of Erech were tough. Throughout history there were many famous sword masters and even sword saints. For example, the sword Saint Gory Keys of the Yabli people 30 years ago was one of them. Among these 3 sword masters from Erech, Buga the Cross served Duke Anthony. Devard and Sylvia had been following this noble family since the previous Duke of Erech. Other than these 3, the Cipher royal family and the Covardo royal family each had a sword master. As for the sword saint, ever since Darius and Gory Keys, no one in Erewhon had obtained the title of sword saint. But now, this young lord was addressing an ordinary-looking middle-aged man beside him as sword saint. For a moment, even though the legendary giant beast was right in front of them, the sailors on the ship couldn't help but raise their eyebrows. Everyone's eyes were focused on Mephisto. This young and famous sword saint was as calm as ever. He turned back and asked, Me? Although the Nagas have released the demon whale, judging from their actions, they don't seem to be willing to pay too much for a single raid. I just need you to make them back off. Brando stared at the sea in the distance, carefully calculating how much confidence he had in his words. In fact, he knew the Nagas very well, but compared to them he knew more about the Nagas. Mephisto thought for a moment and felt that Brando's words were somewhat reasonable. At this moment, Captain James also reacted. He quickly nodded and said, That's right. Although pirates are fugitives, if the loot is not equal to the loss, it is not worth it for them. After saying that, he could not help but look at Mephisto with some doubts. He silently searched for someone who could match this name, but it was destined to be futile. Whether it was Darius or Gory Keys, they had become famous much earlier than Mephisto. Compared to them, Mephisto could be said to be a junior. When did Erewhon have another sword saint? The young captain was extremely puzzled. At this time, the sword saint of Ashes nodded and said, Let me try. After saying that, he placed one hand on the hilt of his sword. Suddenly, everyone felt a terrible burst of pressure from this thin body. The pressure was so strong that it seemed to have formed a substantial wind pressure. Even the sails of the faraway fluttered. Everyone present, including the top gold-ranked existences like Medisha and Scarlet, could not help but feel slightly suffocated. As for the ordinary sailors, their legs almost gave way and they directly knelt on the ground. Heavens, it really is a sword saint. Martha Buff, when did Erewhon have another sword saint? Other than Brando's subordinates, the shock in the hearts of the sailors at this moment reached its peak. But what surprised them was not only Mephisto's identity, but also Brando's origin. Who were these rebels who occupied Tanajil? Among the crowd, only Brando completely ignored the pressure of the Sword Saint of Ash's aura. His willpower had long surpassed the realm of the elemental pinnacle. Not to mention the aura of a Sword Saint, even if it was the innate aura of a dragon rooted in its bloodline, he could completely ignore it. He watched as Mephistopheles released his aura without reservation. Then, a circle of gray light spread out in all directions with the Sword Saint's body as the center. In an instant, it affected the entire sea nearby. For a moment, it was as if the entire ship was dyed with a layer of gray. Gray realm. At this moment, everyone subconsciously shut up. Even the knowledgeable James did not recognize it, but at least he knew that it was the legendary elemental power. Elemental activation. Not to mention swordsmanship, just in terms of strength alone, this was already a true Sword Saint. The people on the ship were not the only ones who quieted down. The demon whale that had just emerged from the water suddenly calmed down and quietly stopped in the sea not far away. This was the respect for the strong. Although the demon whale was a mythical sea monster, in the face of a true elemental activation, it did not dare to recklessly start a fight. This was an ancient creature that lived in the sea. Its intelligence was not inferior to that of sentient humans. For a moment, a strange scene appeared on the sea. There was a brief moment of silence between the tiny three-masted ship far away and the mountain-like demon whale. Neither side dared to attack rashly. Only the ordinary sailors on the ship and the young officers of the White Lion Legion could not help but raise their heads and watch this rare spectacle with their mouths agape. Perhaps some of them would not be lucky enough to see this scene again in their lives. This would be the most legendary and glorious moment of their lives. This was especially true for the sailors who lived on the sea all year round. After a short while, Brando finally saw a few figures emerge from the sea. In an instant, a few men and women appeared on the surface of the sea. Of course, these people were all Nagas. They raised their heads and looked at the people on the ship. Their eyes were also filled with confusion. They were clearly robbing an ordinary human merchant ship, but who knew that this merchant ship was not only armed like a warship, but also had an elemental activation powerhouse. If it was not for the fact that these humans had not taken the initiative to attack, they would have suspected that this was a trap specifically targeted at them. And now, it looked more like they had offended a prince of a country who was traveling incognito. Although it was a little ridiculous, these few leaders of the Nagas did indeed have such thoughts in their minds. Otherwise it would be too ridiculous. They slowly approached the side of far away. After seeing Brando on the ship clearly, they were even more convinced in their hearts. They could not help but raise their heads and ask, "Which family's prince is on the ship?" "Prince?" Before Brando could speak, Amandina, who was beside him, laughed out loud. Brando could not help but look at Amandina strangely. This was because Amandina had always been a relatively stable and cold image in his mind. Besides, he did not know what was so funny about this sentence. Could it be that he was so far away from the image of a prince in her mind? It was like among the princes and princesses of the various kingdoms in Wond, although there was no lack of handsome men and beautiful women, there were also a lot of ugly people. With his current power, cosplaying as a poor prince of a small country was actually not an unacceptable fact. When the noble lady was looked at by Brando, she did not know what to think. She immediately blushed all the way to the base of her neck. She coughed lightly and immediately turned her head to the side. Brando did not know what she was up to, but he did not think much about it. He turned back to look at the Nagas below the ship. At this moment, even the sailors on the ship could see that these Nagas were here to ask for peace. Brando was not wrong. Even if they were robbers, they would not be willing to suffer so much for a robbery. After all, in this part of the sea, there were some people they could afford to offend, and some people they were destined to not touch. A force that had the strength of an elemental awakener as a guard would at least have this kind of strength. But what everyone did not know was that at this moment, Brando looked at the few Nagas below, and a thought flashed through his mind, "It really is you dash." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 527. In fact, other than the Shining Scale Nagas, there were also the Grey Fins, Garo, Sea Serpent Nagas and 6 other races. Among them, Brando knew the Grey Fins Nagas the best. The differences between the Nagas in the deep sea were very different from the differences between the countries on land. Different Nagas came from different races. The Grey Fins Nagas were the descendants of the legendary heavenly serpent Manas. In Cruz's mythology, the dragon of calamity, Tsanglan, and a mortal gave birth to a monster with 12 wings. This monster was the feathered serpent in the legends. It was both good and evil, symbolizing the pinnacle of order. Even today, there were still carvings of this monster under the eaves of courts and arbitration courts. The feathered serpent had 12 descendants, and the heavenly serpent Manus was one of them. According to legends, the heavenly serpent Manus' body was gray and white, and it guarded the entire North Sea. The North Sea was now the outer sea of Fanzan. Hence, the heavenly serpent Manus had always been regarded as the guardian of the 10 cities. As the descendants of Manus, the gray fins Nagas inherited its gray scales and fins. Of course, there was no way to verify whether the legends in the dusty ancient books were true or not. However, Brando knew about these monsters because of his experience in the Amber Sword. He stood at the side of the ship and looked at the Nagas below without saying a word. He knew that these people were not the real leaders of the Nagas. He was waiting for the real leader to come out. The others, including Captain James, received Brando's signal and stood at the side without saying a word. The sailors were also curious about what this young lord wanted to do. From the strength that Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles had shown, he had the ability to do so. Everyone's eyes were now fixed on Brando. The Nagas in the sea saw that the humans on the ship did not say anything and became restless. But after a while, the sea parted and a male and female Naga swam out. The male Naga was tall and strong, and his eyes were different from the other Naga's silver-purple eyes. Instead, they were a translucent amber color. He wore a dark blue fish scale armor, and his weapon was a strangely shaped long sword. It looked like a recurved sword, but the average recurved sword was obviously not as big as this one. The tattoos on the male Naga's face were much more detailed than the other Nagas, and it was filled with a strange, wild beauty. When Brando saw this Naga, he recognized him. This Naga was a wandering boss in the sea. The players used to call him Yellow Eye, but Brando knew its real name. The Naga. It was a Naga. Name it was Naga was a Naga. It was said that when it was much bigger than the average Naga. That was the reason why it was given its name. This story was definitely a joke among the humans, but in the culture of the Nagas, it was something worth boasting about. Being bigger meant being stronger. Sani was born to be a warrior. When he grew up, he became the commander of the Grey Fin Nagas. In the eyes of the players, it was only natural that he would become a boss. Humans, where did you come from? Sani raised his head and glanced at the three-masted ship. A hint of doubt flashed in his amber eyes, but he was much more mature and did not jump to a conclusion. Captain James was about to answer, but Brando beat him to it and said, Sani, the 7 seas is the land of freedom to carry out the will of Martha. You Nagas have received the grace of the goddess, but you do not repent. Instead, you continue to plunder ships and kill people. Are you not afraid of punishment? His words shocked everyone. Although they had the Sword Saint as their backer, there was no need to offend the Naga. The demon whale was also a legendary sea monster. Brando's words were purely to tease the Naga. Even Mephisto looked at him in confusion. Little guy, what are you up to now? Orthlis, who was in Brando's ring, knew Brando better. She knew that he would not do anything rash. Watch me, Brando replied secretly. Sani's expression changed. Of course, he could hear the ridicule in the other party's words. But what made him even more surprised was that the other party actually called out his name. The Grey Fins had recently encountered some unforeseen events, and he had only recently taken over the position of the previous Legion commander and became the new commander of the Grey Fins Naga army. It was impossible for him to have any reputation in the 7 seas. Who are you? How do you know me? Sani thought for a long time but could not think of a reason. Instead, he felt that this group of humans was more mysterious and suspicious. However, the more mysterious the opponent was, the more he did not dare to act rashly. He could only frown and ask, My lord, you know these Nagas? Captain James could not help but ask. Hee. Brando could not help but smile proudly. The people on the land had always been arrogant. Outside of civilization there was only wilderness. Although the Nagas often attacked merchant ships and even ports, no one would know the details of a group of bandits. Perhaps the naval commanders in places like Grey Harbor and Ampere Seal would know some detailed information, but the lords and nobles on the land would not care about this. But he just knew. Brendel was secretly delighted. Compared to the others on the ship at this moment, the nervousness caused by the thought of being attacked had disappeared. Of course, he knew the other party. Not only did he know the other party's name, he also knew that this guy was a simple-minded fool. Other than being brave and good at fighting and having a brain full of muscles, there was nothing good about him. He even had the nickname, Dumb Fish. He knew this guy from the first time he explored the Kalanga Mountains in the game. They were both attacked by the Grey Fin Nagas, but the team led by his senior was not to be trifled with. They easily defeated the other party's attack. The Nagas did not always bring the demon whales and mermaids along as bandits. Otherwise, they would have been annihilated by the navies of the surrounding countries. What happened next was that Erewhon's players generously released the other party's captives and won the friendship of the other party. This friendship did not seem to be very strong, but the Grey Fin Nagas had always kept this friendship. Even when Erewhon was destroyed, Sani, who had already sat on the throne, led the Grey Fin Nagas to support Erewhon's navy. This was only because Brando's guild was on Erewhon's side. This friendship had been maintained for a long time in the Amber Sword. Before Brando went north to join the Knight's Kingdom, Grecius, he had stayed in the Shining Sea for a period of time. At that time, many Erewhon's players used this as a base to fight guerrilla warfare in Erewhon's territory. Although they did not manage to save the kingdom's fate in the end, the Grey Fin Naga's favor was remembered in everyone's heart. Brando was no exception. When he saw this familiar face, although the Naga's face looked a little strange, his heart was filled with a strange feeling. It was just like when he saw the Valkyrie when she was still a village girl. The feeling of returning to the old land and seeing everything in history unfold in front of his eyes spontaneously arose. Brando couldn't help but take a deep breath. Only when he saw these familiar people did he feel like he was truly living in this world. But of course he knew that this sense of familiarity was just an illusion. At this moment the Naga didn't recognize him and he didn't know him either. The Faraway had never released the Grey Fin Naga's prisoners, and they had never received any favors from the Grey Fin Naga. Both sides had nothing to do with each other, and if he didn't answer his next question properly, he was afraid that both sides would meet on the battlefield. At this moment, everyone was waiting for him to answer. Brando thought about it seriously and replied, "I think your father should remember the merchant ship that passed by here 20 years ago, right?" When Sani heard 20 years ago, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. This was the first possibility that came to his mind. This was actually related to his own privacy. His father was saved by a human merchant on this sea 20 years ago. If it wasn't for this matter, Sani might not even exist in this world. The Grey Fin Naga valued their reputation and knew how to repay kindness. Of course, his father had told him about this matter, hoping that he would have the opportunity to meet the merchant or the merchant's descendant again so that he could repay his kindness. Sani had never told anyone about this matter, so of course he wouldn't suspect that Brando was lying to him. But unfortunately Brando really was lying to him. This was because Sani would never have dreamed that he would tell Brando and the others about this matter in the future. At that time their friendship was already very deep. Sani hoped that Brando and the others could go to the mainland to help him find the merchant. Of course that was another quest in the Amber Sword and in the end it was left unfinished. But Brando didn't expect that it would come in handy at this moment. And coincidentally, the merchant was a hawk from the south of Saint Tassol, which was relatively close to Karsuk. It was only separated by a strait, and there were also ruins of the Highland Wizards. Brando's lie about being the merchant's descendant or being related to the merchant was completely understandable. "My father passed away 3 years ago," Sani replied, "but I dare not forget the matter you mentioned." "You are?" "I'm not the merchant's descendant, but I have some relationship with him. I heard him talk about this matter. I'm the descendant of the Highland Wizards. You know that people like us like to get to the bottom of things, so I specifically investigated this matter to see if it was true or not. That's how I learned about your father and your situation. If I have offended you, please forgive me." Brando smiled and replied. He didn't want to force Sani to repay his kindness. In the game he and Sani were very close, so he wouldn't do such a thing. In fact, he only mentioned this matter to find an excuse to get closer to Sani. Brando believed that he could win Sani's favor just like in the game. Because in a sense, they and the players in Senpai's team who had been fighting for Erewhon's fate were actually the same kind of people. Sani was silent for a while. Finally he nodded and replied, "I see. Then the attack just now was our fault. Fortunately it didn't cause any serious consequences. Since you are the friend of an old friend, I promise that your ships will be able to pass through the sea area without being attacked. The Grey Fin Nagas will never go back on their words." Sani's words were very awkward and Brando couldn't help but laugh secretly. This guy was still as stupid as before. He knew that Sani wouldn't do anything to harm the Grey Fin Nagas because of personal friendship. If he was really the descendant of an old friend, Sani would definitely report to the queen. Thinking about it, the Grey Fin Nagas should still be ruled by the Frost Dew Queen. Brando remembered that the Pearl of the Grey Fin Nagas would die of illness 3 years later. After that, Sani rose step by step and became the king of the Grey Fin Nagas. But now, the most powerful and beautiful queen in the history of the Greyfin Nagas should still be in power. Although Brando knew that Sani would definitely be able to convince the queen, he wouldn't skip this step. This guy was such a stubborn person. And now he was saying this because Brando's strength had won the respect of the other party. The Nagas were unwilling to fight with a warship, with a sword saint, so they were forced to find an excuse. Brando had seen many such excuses before, but to be able to say it as bluntly as Sani, he was the only one in the entire Shining Sea. Thinking of this, he smiled and asked, "Thank you very much, but I still have a question." Everyone was stunned. When they heard that the Nagas would let them go, Captain James and the other sailors heaved a sigh of relief. After all, no one would feel good when there was a prehistoric beast cruising next to them. When they heard that they could escape, they were naturally relieved. But they didn't expect that not only did Brando not leave, he even took the initiative to climb over. What was there to discuss with a robber? Wouldn't it be better to leave as soon as possible? Everyone couldn't help but have such a thought. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 528. I've rarely heard of mermaids and Nagas appearing together. What's the reason for that? Brando asked as he stood by the side of the ship. It's none of your business, human. Before Sani could answer, the girl beside him scolded him coldly. Brando then noticed that the girl only had a pair of jade-like arms. She had a graceful figure and looked like a human girl. She was not a Naga, but she was a real mermaid. Looking at her, she seemed to be angry. The mermaids were kind by nature and never participated in robbing merchant ships. If the Grey Fins were not facing a life-and-death crisis, they would not have broken their promise and appeared here. What made Jenny angry was that this young man actually asked, "I've rarely heard of mermaids and Nagas appearing together. What's the reason for that?" She could not help but grit her teeth. She was afraid that if this rumor spread, the world would think that the mermaids were robbers too. "Looks like you're in some trouble too," Brando replied sharply. "What are you trying to say?" Sani frowned. "I just want to ask if there's anything we can do to help?" Brando asked tentatively. Sani hesitated for a moment. He seemed to be moved, but his expression changed. Brando guessed that the Greyfin's Nagas were in real trouble. Otherwise they would not be so hesitant. He searched his memory for the big events that happened in the Shining Sea during this period. He vaguely remembered the legendary War of the Western Sea. However, the War of the Western Sea started earlier than the War of the Black Rose. It lasted from the beginning of the game to the end of the first act. There were only a few introductions on the forum. This was a war that happened at the border of Erewhon. There were almost no players outside the civilization that participated in it. Brando thought for a moment and said, "How about this? We're actually merchants too. We have a lot of goods on board. If you need anything, we can talk about business here. There's no need to stick to formalities when doing business." Even Captain James could see that he was trying to befriend the Greyfin Nagas. However, the young captain had his doubts. The Greyfin Nagas were not the strongest pirates in the Glittering Sea, and it was unknown whether they were trustworthy or not. Moreover, the Greyfin Nagas were not the strongest in the Glittering Sea. "You make it sound nice." The mermaid spoke again. Her voice was very pleasant, as if she was singing. However, it was very tricky. "Didn't you say that we are bandits? What if we ask for the money on your ship? Will you agree or not?" After saying that, she stared at Brando. If this fake businessman said no, she would definitely mock him for going back on his words. If she agreed, judging from the sparkle in her eyes, she would probably climb up the pole. However, the mermaid knew that human merchants had always been stingy and greedy, and would most likely find an excuse. Unexpectedly, Brando didn't even think about it and directly replied, "It's not impossible." The mermaid's eyes widened in surprise. "Hey human. Don't you want to do business? Who does business like you?" She was sure that Brando was making fun of them and couldn't help but question him. "I've heard that the war between the Nagas has reached its climax, and there are proxy wars between the countries on the continent. I'll invest in your war, and if you win, I might be able to get a share of the profits. Even if I lose, I'll only lose a ship of goods. However, I can still buy a favor. Why wouldn't I do such a profitable business?" Brando asked. When he said that, the mermaid immediately became alert. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows and ask, "How do you know that we're at war?" "He tricked you." Sani sighed. Although he was rigid, he wasn't stupid. The so-called dumb fish was just a nickname that Brendel and the others gave him, saying that he did not know how to be flexible. He reached out and pulled the mermaid behind him, afraid that this stubborn witch would reveal all their secrets. He had never heard of doing business like this before. Wouldn't it be a huge loss for them? The mermaid finally reacted and couldn't help but gnash her teeth as she glared at Brando. She had never seen such a despicable person before. No wonder the elders in her tribe said that humans were treacherous and cunning. The people behind Brando wanted to laugh but didn't dare to, especially Carglass. The young man felt that his lord was extremely cunning. He had heard that his lord's fiancée was good at managing money and was a first-class merchant, but now it seemed that it was just a matter of family tradition. Only Amandina couldn't help but remind him, "My lord?" Brando nodded at her, indicating that she didn't need to worry. He knew that she was afraid that he would lose out. It wasn't a big deal to lose a ship's worth of goods, but if Brando really invested in a war, Tanajal's finances would definitely not be able to support it. Of course, he was just saying it because he knew the direction of history. The Grey-Fin Nagas might not be able to unify the Shining Sea, but at least they would still exist a few decades later. This meant that even if they didn't win this war, at least they didn't lose too badly. Moreover, even if Brando wanted to invest, Sani and the legendary Naga Queen might not accept it. Everyone knew that there was no such thing as charity in this world. "All right," Sani finally thought it through and asked, "Human, do you have any herbs on your ship?" "Herbs? Are any of you injured?" Brando keenly grasped the crux of the problem. There was no lack of herbs in the sea, but the Nagas lacked alchemy skills. They must have some important person who was seriously injured, and ordinary people wouldn't use the demon whale and the mermaids. He immediately thought of the Naga Queen's illness that would happen 3 years later. He thought that it might not be an illness at all, but that she died because her injuries were too serious. The Naga Queen had the strength of an elemental awakener, so it was completely possible that her injuries dragged on for 3 years. The more Brando thought about it, the more he felt that his guess was the closest to the truth. "You're asking too much," Sani replied unhappily. "All right, let me guess. I heard that there are many rare herbs in the deep sea. Normal injuries wouldn't be a problem for you. Even though there are only some herbs on far away, I heard that the medical skills on land are much better than the kingdoms in the deep sea. I just happen to have some magical substitutes here which might be useful for you," Brando replied. "What is that?" Sani asked. Brando had already taken out a small, translucent crystal bottle. This was the most valuable gift that Amon had given to him, holy water number 1. There were only a few bottles of holy water number 1 in the first place. This was a product that even the top archbishop and alchemist of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had to put in all their effort and take months to complete. The 2 bottles in his hands might be the last samples left in the world. Brando decided to take a gamble. If the other party was really injured by the legendary queen, then this bottle of potion would be worth it. If not, then he would lose everything. But since he had already taken it out, he wouldn't be stingy. He directly threw the bottle that was worth 10,000 gold. Sani took the bottle of holy water number 1 and was a little confused. Of course, he recognized that this was the water of life. However, the Nagas had been robbing Erewhon's merchant ships for many years, so they had a lot of holy water in stock. It was not that they hadn't used these holy water before, but it was useless. The bottle of holy water in his hand was one size smaller than the average holy water, so it might be even less useful. He raised his head and was about to ask when the mermaid behind him suddenly changed her expression. She grabbed the bottle of holy water number 1 from his hand and carefully opened the cork to take a sniff. Then, as if she had been electrocuted, she immediately put the cork back. Sani saw that the witch who had followed him was trembling. He knew that something was wrong. Although the other party was a little naive, she had inherited the profound knowledge of the witches. She definitely wouldn't act like this for no reason. "What's going on?" He couldn't help but ask. If I'm not wrong, this should be holy water number 1. The mermaid's voice was trembling as she whispered. "Holy water number 1? What's that?" Sani didn't understand. "Let's put it this way. Master Sani, if the glittering sea has an owner with just this bottle of holy water, you can buy half of the glittering sea." Jenny replied with a strange expression. This time Sani was also stunned. He suddenly felt that what he had just received was not a bottle of potion, but a heavy bomb. Although it wasn't the first time he had participated in a robbery, he had never seen goods of this level of value. The Nagas were also selective when they robbed merchant ships. They would usually avoid the truly large merchant ships and royal fleets. Otherwise, the navies of the various countries around the glittering sea would not be easy to deal with. "Can it be cured?" Sani couldn't help but stutter. "Enough. It's completely enough. We don't need that much at all. Just a little will do." The mermaid replied happily. Sani fell silent for a moment. Then he raised his head and looked at Brando. Human, are you really going to give this to us? You know we can't possibly afford this price. It's okay, Brando replied as if he didn't care. Like I said before, if we can't afford it, I can buy a share. How could he buy a share in a war? Sani felt that this human was becoming more and more mysterious. He had never seen anyone do business like this. However, he thought for a moment and asked seriously, "Then may I know your name, sir?" "Just call me Brando. Because of what I'm doing now, it's not convenient for me to reveal my surname," Brando replied half-truthfully. "I understand. Alright, I'll say it again here. I, Sani, in the name of the Grey Finns clan, declare that from today onwards, as long as the merchant ships on this sea carry your name, they will be under the protection of the Grey Finns Nagas. Any attack on these merchant ships will be seen as a provocation to the Grey Finns Nagas. We will fight back with war." Sani's resolute voice echoed on the surface of the sea. As soon as he said this, it was Captain James's turn to change his expression. Sani seemed to be repeating what he had said before, but the meaning behind it was completely different. This time, Sani's promise was obviously more formal and detailed. If what he said was true, then it meant that in the future, all of Brando's merchant ships on the Shining Sea would have almost no chance of being robbed. And as long as the Grey Finns Nagas existed, this fact would continue. As someone who made a living on the sea all year round, the young captain naturally understood the meaning behind this. One had to know that apart from the large merchant ships and the royal fleet, the probability of ordinary merchant ships being robbed on the Shining Sea was as high as 30%. Small merchants could face the situation of losing everything at any time. However, with this promise from Sani, it was almost certain that Brando's merchant fleet would be comparable to the famous merchant groups in Ampere Seal in the future. If Brando had the intention to do business, however, Sani looked deeply at Brando and added, "Not only that, if your Excellency's goods are really as effective as you say, then I promise as long as your Excellency does not do anything hostile to the Grey Finns Nagas in the future, your Excellency will always be a friend of our clan." What he meant was that if Brando lied about the holy water, then the previous agreement would definitely not be valid. Sani did not say anything definite. After all, he still did not believe that a strange human would promise such a huge benefit for no reason. Since the witch said that this bottle of potion was worth half of the Shining Sea, then the true value of this bottle of potion was worth half of the Shining Sea. Sani did not believe that any human would be willing to give away such a huge fortune. However, after the experiment, everything would be determined. He gestured to the other Nagas, then turned around and dived into the sea with the mermaid, leaving only a white trail on the surface of the sea. The remaining Nagas waited for the two of them to completely disappear before saying to Brando and the rest, "Human friends, Lord Sani has ordered us to escort you on your journey." Brando nodded. Although it was an escort, it was actually a surveillance. However, as long as Sani could prove that the number one holy water he gave was real, then these Nagas would be hell-bent on escorting them to Ampere Seal. Naturally, he would be happy to have some guards for no reason. However, compared to this, he had actually been observing Sani's left shoulder. He remembered that when they first met in the future, there was a scary scar there, but he could not see it now. It must have been left in this battle. Brando originally wanted to remind Sani, but after thinking about it, he gave up. After all, for every warrior, the experience of being on the verge of death was very precious. He turned around and realized that he had done a huge favor for the Nagas. Their friendship had been established, and it was an unexpected surprise for this trip. Brando raised his head and saw that the sailors were preparing to set sail again. Captain James stood at the side and said enviously, "My lord is really doing good business." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 529. As the busiest commercial port and cargo distribution center in Erewhon, and even the entire southern part of Cruz, the port was bustling all day long, from the early hours of the morning when the lampposts were hung with cold, shaky lights until the moon rose above the sea. Merchants and dockworkers were busy all day long, accumulating an astonishing amount of wealth for this giant port. Only during the season when storms visited the Shining Sea every year would this Golden Sea route be deserted, allowing the residents of the city to stop and rest for a while. Archbishop Wood stood under the white stone lighthouse, wearing a white robe with red trim. A figure like him was sent here by the Holy Cathedral to serve as the bishop of the Ampere Seal Diocese and the spiritual leader of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in Erewhon. As long as he stayed in this position for 15 years, he would have the qualifications to enter the core power of the Holy Cathedral and become one of the 11 great priests. At that point, even the position of High Priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just a step away. Most people would not be able to imagine what a person of his status would want. Wood's face was thin and his cheeks were sunken. Even though he was not even 80 years old, he looked like an old man who had been through a lot. Only his sunken eyes were still bright and full of vigor. His majestic aura was enough to make a normal person cower in fear. The archbishop pursed his lips and looked calm, but his heart was not any calmer than the nobles in Aween who had been around for a while. The lion beast men in Toquinen are ready to make a move. They must have the support of the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Wood stood on the hillside and looked at the sailing ships of various sizes coming in and out of the port, leaving long trails in the blue bay. The sailing sails formed a strange sight in the waters of the pier. Every waterway was full of experienced navigators waiting to enter and exit. The wealth contained in the endless stream made the high and mighty man sigh. Erewhon is the front line against the Holy Cathedral of Earth. We cannot allow this civil war to continue for too long. We don't have much time left. Beside him, his good friend, Priest Icon, nodded in agreement. The two of them had been partners for many years. Although neither of them were natives of Erewhon, they knew this ancient kingdom like the back of their hand. However, the lion beast men are getting restless. If they really want to invade, they'll probably have to wait until next year. Especially since they haven't received any rations this autumn, the Earth Holy Hall won't dare to act rashly. Wood glanced at his companion. Do you know how old this white stone lighthouse is, Icon? Priest Icon glanced at the lighthouse beside them. This lighthouse was once the symbol of Ampere Seal. When the late King Eric built the port here, Ampere Seal was far from its current size, and it was not a so-called trading port. This lighthouse once guided the navy of the late King Eric and the navy of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to battle on the nearby sea. The white stone lighthouse had always been seen as a symbol of Erewhon, a symbol of persistence in the darkness. It's a pity that the lighthouse was destroyed in a fire 50 years ago. Its historical value was also destroyed. Although a new lighthouse was rebuilt, it's not the same as the original. Icon understood what his companion meant. He admired the royal faction and Her Royal Highness because they had the same persistence for glory as him. However, history was history, and Wood was obviously reminding him to look at all of this fairly. This kingdom is the same. No matter how old it is, the glory it insisted on has been abandoned by its descendants. What's left is just a shell. In comparison, it was given a new mission just like this lighthouse. That's its true value. I understand, Lord Archbishop, Icon replied humbly. Wood nodded. The Holy Cathedral had always been fair and would not easily interfere in the internal affairs of its subordinate countries. That was why they could maintain their authority. He and his assistant had been partners for many years, and he admired his insistence on justice and honor. But that was then and this was now. He would never allow his assistant to interfere in Aween's internal affairs and side with the princess. Thinking of this, the archbishop could not help but look back at the direction of the city. Ampere Seal was one of the largest cities in the south. The harbor was connected to the back and the roofs extended far into the horizon like an ant's nest. The tallest building in the city was undoubtedly the temple of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The temple was looming in the fog. He could not help but think of what the little girl Magadal had mentioned to him and shook his head. That was impossible. The Holy Cathedral would not side with either side no matter what, and the great priest would not be so hasty. At this time, the bell on the white lighthouse rang again. The sound of the bronze bell caused the nearby ground to tremble and the sand to shake. The sound could be heard for dozens of miles, and even half of the city could hear it clearly. The bell indicated that a ship had entered the harbor. Wood and Icon looked up and saw a sailboat with 3 large sails entering the harbor. It's a ship coming back from Lübeck. Icon recognized the flag on the ship immediately. At this time of the year, the storm is about to close off the southern sea route. This should be the last ship coming back from Lübeck this month. It's a little late. People who sail the sea all year round are desperate. Wood looked at the ship and could not help but sigh. People are blinded by money. Although wealth is important, it is not as precious as life. Icon shook his head. But this time the archbishop did not agree. He only sighed with a famous joke by Hesse I, who was ridiculed as the king of the road in Erewhon's history. Without wealth, how can there be life? The 2 high priests sighed on the lighthouse hill, but the officials of the Port Authority of Ampere Seal were not so idle. To be exact, these small people who were usually busy were almost in a mess. Kinoan Paris was the son of a noble family in Ampere Seal that was neither too big nor too small. Relying on his father's connections, he finally became the deputy director of the Port Authority. However, less than half a week after he took office, A piece of news almost made him throw away the pointed helmet on his head and run away in panic. What did you say? Palian, you bastard, what did I tell you yesterday? If you drink too much or joke with me again, I will definitely drive you out. I don't care who you are. The unlucky young man roared angrily at the communication crystal in his hand. He almost threw the valuable thing away. Do you think I'm an idiot? No, I'm serious. On the other end of the communication crystal was Kinoan's good friend. In Aween's words, they were brothers who grew up together. Even though they were both descendants of nobles, he was not very reliable. He drank too much, played with women while on duty, got into fights, and did almost everything that could be done on the docks. But Kinoan kept him here because their relationship could be described with the word iron. But at this moment, the usually sloppy young man seemed to have suffered a great shock. He said in a mournful tone, "Brother, I swear in the name of Lady Martha that I didn't lie to you. I really saw a demon whale. Of course, if the woman who claimed to be a female pirate didn't lie to me, listen to me, that thing is exactly the same as the tattoo on her left, but... No, I have to say that the things at sea are much scarier now. F***ck but don't mention that woman to me." Kinoan did not even care about the last bit of modesty he had as a noble. Of course, this generation of nobles did not have much modesty to speak of, especially young people who grew up in the mixed environment of Ampere Seal. He pulled at his collar fiercely, but when he heard that the other party swore in the name of Martha, he felt a little uncertain. He also understood that if possible, this lawless guy would even dare to sleep with Lady Martha. Of course, this was just a saying. Kinoan was now beginning to feel a little helpless. A demon whale was about to attack the port? Oh my god, was he living in a mythical era? Kinoan sat at his expensive mahogany desk and thought for a long time. With great difficulty, he came up with the following 3 comprehensive plans. Abscond with the money, abscond with the money, and abscond with the money. But he immediately crumpled his hair into a ball. If he did that, his old man would be the first to kill him. Kinoan was born to be as lawless as his good brother, and he was not even afraid of the king of Aween. However, he immediately revealed his true colors in front of his old man. When he thought of his old man's angry face, his legs turned to jelly. He grabbed the communication crystal with great difficulty and swallowed his saliva. "Brother, good luck, I'll take my leave first. Wait for me, I'll be right there." Kinoan's words turned into, "Wait for me, I'll be there right away." The soldiers at the port were in a mess, but at this moment, a certain person on the sea looked at Ampere Seal from afar and felt very helpless. The port city of Ampere Seal and the surrounding areas and towns have a population of 310,000. A huge magic system maintains the operation of the city, such as sewage, lighting, water supply, and garbage disposal. The mysterious magic that is rarely seen in the countryside south of Erewhon is everywhere here. Merchants spend a lot of money to hire wizards to serve them. Some of these wizards have worked here for decades and are deeply rooted in their positions. The wizards have formed their own guild called the Eye of Ampere Seal. This wizard organization not only maintains the daily operation of the city, but also intervenes in the security of the port. They prevent adventurers from fighting and set up a city lock to prevent foreign wizards from casting spells in the city. They also set up a super large anti-air magic circle in the inner city of Ampere Seal to prevent the port from being attacked from the sky. Brando stood at the side of the ship and introduced the port to the others. Suddenly he sighed. He turned his head with a helpless and almost desperate look in his eyes. Finally, he saw the legendary monster, the king of the sea beasts, the demon whale that was as huge as a mountain wave its fins at them like a naughty child, and then slowly dived into the deep sea. My old man said that the demon whale's intelligence is not inferior to that of an adult, and now it seems that it is true. Captain James also saw this scene and could not help but sigh. But Amandina looked at Brando suspiciously and could not help but ask, "My lord, what exactly did you give the Nagas? Why did they look at you as if they were looking at their king? They actually let the demon whale escort us into the port. How are we going to hide our identities now? But I heard that the Naga's king is a woman." After a week of training, the little Roman could now freely appear on the deck. She rolled her eyes and directly feminized Brando. Brando wiped the sweat off his forehead. He did not expect the Nagas to be so hospitable, but to let the demon whale escort them into the port, Brando felt that other than the dumb fish Sani, most people would not be able to do something so creative. He coughed and said in disbelief, "Let's see how it goes. Anyway, the people in the port don't know that this big guy is following us. As long as we don't admit it, it'll be fine." With that, he looked at the young captain. James shrugged and replied, "My lord doesn't want to be famous, so I naturally will not overstep my boundaries. "My lord, you can rest assured about the people on my ship." At this point, the young captain was actually a little helpless. "To be honest, my lord's reputation is much higher than mine. Even if I don't say anything, they will still keep their mouths shut." What he was talking about was naturally the 2 bottles of holy water that Brando gave him. It could be said that the entire ship's sailors now respected Brando, who had a sword saint as his teacher and was a kind and amiable noble like a god. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 530. When the demon whale disappeared from the surface of the sea, the guards of the port of Ampere Seal almost set off their cannons in celebration. When Faraway docked, Brando and the rest were not interrogated because Lord Kinoan was busy thinking about how to write about how he fought off the legendary sea monster. Furthermore, there was more than one ship entering and leaving the port. No one would have thought that a demon whale was here to escort Faraway, a 3-masted ship that had just entered the port. Sometimes the truth was closer to a lie, but if anyone dared to tell Kinoan this, the head of the port authority would definitely throw them into the sea to feed the sharks. He did not want his subordinates to treat him like a fool. Faraway docked at Pier 14. As soon as Brando got off the ship, he saw Sue coming to greet him. Sue had arrived in Ampere Seal under her father's request. This almond-skinned girl with braided hair was now in charge of managing Tanajal's trade with the outside world. She enjoyed a lot of independence. When she was in Bragg's, she did her job faithfully. Brando trusted her and entrusted her with important tasks. Now, Sue controlled almost all of Tanajal's funds, but when she came to greet them, she was still wearing the same checkered dress as before. When Sue saw Brando, she was a little surprised. Although she knew about the changes in the past year from the letters she exchanged with her father, and knew about Brando's identity and the funds in his hands, she could not help but take a second look at Brando. Brando smiled at her. He was in a good mood to see an old acquaintance of Fortress Reedon. The girl ignored him with a straight face. Of course, she did not forget about her relationship with him. She heard that there were a few more girls around the Lord. She was not at ease leaving Freya in the hands of such a playboy. She was only willing to serve Brando because of her father. "Sue." The Roman jumped down from the gangplank and grabbed the girl's hand. His eyes were shining. "Thank you so much for the past few months. Are you okay? I heard from Uncle Reto that you often work late. He's very worried about you." The little Roman was now in charge of Tanajal's business and economy. In a sense, Sue was her direct subordinate. Of course, someone didn't realize it, but Sue couldn't ignore it. The girl glanced at Brando and lowered her head slightly. "Miss Roman. Don't be like that. Do you see that the Roman doesn't want to say anything? I can help you pass on the message." Sue didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the merchant lady's antics. He finally managed to maintain his solemn expression and asked, "Is father all right?" "He's doing well." Brando finally found the opportunity to interject. "As you know from the letter, everything in the territory is on the right track, and the war has come to an end. Although I don't approve of it, your father has officially become a farmer. He's lost a lot of hair over the reclamation of the Maxon region. He's like a real old farmer, and he's thrown my military training program aside." "He used to farm," Sue replied. "Well, then he's going back to his old profession." Brando replied somewhat mischievously. Sue thought of her father's appearance and her lips curled up slightly. However, she was dissatisfied with Brando's tone. She glared at him and asked stiffly, "What does my lord want to do next?" "Of course, I want to take a break first," Brando replied. This was the truth. Although he had been through many storms, he felt as if the ground was shaking after a week on the ship. If he was like this, there was no need to talk about the others. The young men of the White Lion Legion were fine on the ship, but when they stepped on solid land, they ran to the side and vomited. The little Roman's body swayed from side to side, but he didn't seem to be aware of it. "I've already arranged a place to stay. It's in the city's Bauhinia Inn. However, my lord brought a lot of people, and it would be too conspicuous for everyone to stay in one inn. That's why I rented the apartment opposite. It's safer and less likely to attract attention. In addition, I've also bought a farmhouse that can be used as shelter if necessary." Sue glanced at him and replied. Brando was slightly surprised. He didn't expect this girl to be so capable. She had completed her missions in the past few months in a very orderly manner. Brando liked her for her honesty and reliability, but he didn't expect her to be so quick-witted. Knowing that they might encounter trouble on this trip, she had already arranged a place for them in advance. "Then let's go." Brando suddenly felt that it was too easy to have such a capable subordinate. "Are there any carriages?" Sue nodded. Not only were there carriages but Su had also prepared 10 of them. However, these 10 carriages weren't parked together, but set off in several batches. Brando let his men ride the carriages into the city first. It wasn't his first time in Ampere Seal, but he knew that the young men of the White Lion Legion who came from the countryside of Tonajul couldn't wait to see the largest and most prosperous city in Erewhon. The carriages entered the inner city from the port gate. Because of the constant flow of goods, the roads in this area were wet and emitted a salty smell of the sea. Most of the buildings on both sides of the road were all kinds of trading houses. From fur to logs, from gems to metal minerals, as well as art, gold and silver utensils, goods from all over the world gathered here. In any place south of Ampere Seal, you wouldn't see so many people gathered in one place. These people came from the north, the south and even foreign lands. Amandina even saw some merchants, mercenaries, adventurers and travelers from the Nine Phoenix Empire. They were all dressed differently and everyone in the carriage was stunned for a moment. The carriages passed by some tall buildings. Most of the merchants had built majestic trading houses to show the strength of their business groups. The noble lady and the merchant lady had never seen such a majestic building before. They couldn't help but exclaim, "It's amazing. Bragg City Hall is just like this." Brando didn't comment on Amandina's words. The 14th Bishop of Ampere Seal, Andra, once said that, "There are gold and opportunities here." This sentence expressed the yearning of the people for this giant port, but countless people also went bankrupt here. People often only looked at the surface, but often ignored the opportunities and risks. The carriages passed by the second city gate. This was a majestic fortress. When Brando first came here in the game, he couldn't afford the expensive carriages in the city. He still remembered the shock of walking through the fortress. This was the gateway to Ampere Seal. Ampere Seal was not only a good trading port, but also a naval fortress of the late King Eric. Ampere Seal had mountains on both sides, and it was almost impossible to attack from land. The only way in was through the sea. Hence, the fortress that guarded this gateway was built to be extremely ridiculous. This petrol fortress looked like a towering mountain from the outside. Due to its special construction requirements, its watchtower could observe any ship within a radius of tens of nautical miles on the sea. Hence, the fortress looked particularly tall, especially when the Holy Cathedral added a giant statue of the Flame King on top of it during the second reconstruction. The entire fortress looked like a temple in the clouds. After passing through this fortress, there was Ampere Seal's famous Square Avenue. There were many hotels here, and the level of luxury was no less than that of the palace. There were also all kinds of luxurious apartments. Many foreign travelers and merchants lived here all year round. The locals called it the Golden Square. Although it was only a small area in the first half of the huge city, it was the most luxurious place in the port. Brando looked at the exquisite statues and gardening on the Square Avenue as he slowly walked away from the carriage. He couldn't help but have the illusion that he was revisiting an old place. But in fact, it was just that he was revisiting an old place, only slightly different. Brando still couldn't see the future. The first time he came here was during the Flower Festival in Ampere Seal. At that time it was much more lively, not to mention the players. "It's so beautiful." The Roman leaned her whole body against the window of the carriage, her chin resting on the window frame as she muttered to herself. It was worrying that she would collapse one side of the carriage. "The future Valhalla will be even more beautiful," Brando replied. "Really?" The Roman turned her head. She really did turn her head. This young lady seemed to be too lazy to even move her body. She used her chin as a fulcrum to tilt her head, completing this difficult movement. Because she couldn't turn her head completely, she squinted at Brando, looking very cute. "Of course." Brando replied affirmatively. He had seen the world tree in the loop of trade winds, and he had no doubts about the future of his territory. Besides, it was his city. How could it be bad? But in the midst of the conversation, the carriage suddenly stopped, and some guards appeared outside the carriage. Brando was slightly startled. He thought that the guards of the Port Authority had finally reacted and came to arrest the culprit. But he saw Sue, who was sitting opposite him, shaking her head at him, indicating that they didn't need to be nervous. "What's going on?" "Nothing. I heard that the Lion Men in the north are about to make a move, and the Holy Cathedral has tightened the security. Ampere Seal is a mixed bag, and this is to prevent spies from sneaking into Erewhon disguised as merchants," Sue said lightly. Brando remembered that there was indeed such a thing. Historically, the Lion Men in Toquinen had been restless since the War of the Black Rose, but the tribes on the Great Plains also had a lot of problems to deal with, so they only invaded Erewhon in the spring of the second year after the Year of the Sword. When the war began, Erewhon had not recovered from the Civil War, but soon the princess regent who had just come to power, stabilized the situation. Then the players joined the war, and that war was also the war that established the princess's prestige. But it was still early and there was still a year to go. Brando was relieved after hearing that, but he remembered something else and couldn't help but ask, how are the negotiations with the nobles? Ordinary people aren't too sure, but it's said that the first negotiation failed, and the next one will be a week later. Sue glanced at Brando. The negotiations between the princess and Duke Arek have made progress. Her ministers have met with the Duke's envoys 3 times this week, but I haven't heard that they have formed an alliance. Now that the nobles of the north and south have gathered in Ampere Seal, I guess the next meeting will be after the nobles' meeting. Brando nodded. This was more or less what he expected. Everything now was basically in line with the timeline in history and he still had some time. But when he looked at Sue he couldn't help but sigh. That little barmaid from Fortress Reden had grown up so quickly, becoming a talent who could hold her own. No matter who saw Sue now, they wouldn't associate her with that little girl from before. Thinking of this, he was silent for a while and suddenly said, "Then if I want to participate in the nobles' meeting, is there any way?" "It's not easy." The girl shook her head gently. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.